have Tim Ormsby, Amy Kosandiak and Kayla Murray from Flinders University, with Tim Amy here in person in Naarm. Amy Kosandiak is a senior librarian within the education engagement team at Flinders University. Kayla Murray is a librarian at Flinders University working as part of the education engagement and is also a member of the Library Reconciliation Action Plan Working Group at Flinders. Tim Ormsby is a senior librarian leading Flinders' contribution to CALL's OER Collective and chairs the Library's Reconciliation Action Plan Working Group. Their presentation is entitled Searching for Voices and Perspectives, the Challenge in Delivering Library Support for Embedding Indigenous Knowledges.
Good afternoon, everyone. I assume there's something to click the slides across. Oh, thank God. I'd just like to start off by acknowledging that we are very lucky here to be with you all today on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, and we pay respect to their elders past and present. We would also like to acknowledge that Amy and myself are very privileged to live and work on the lands of the Kaurna and Paramank nations of the Adelaide Plains and Adelaide Hills respectively, and we also acknowledge their elders past and present. And finally, we'd also like to acknowledge all our Indigenous colleagues both here in the room and online. Flinders University is in the middle of its second Reconciliation Action Plan. The first ran from 2020 to 2022, during which the library initiated numerous projects to further reconciliation within our sphere of influence, including a lot of reparative cataloguing. In 2023, our second reconciliation plan was launched, and this plan had a strong focus on indigenising the curriculum at Flinders. Early in 2023, my team was contacted by an academic in drama at Flinders who was interested in integrating Indigenous voices into one of his topics. Through him, I was introduced to Dr. Joanne Buckskin, a lecturer in Indigenous Studies at Flinders, who was helping other academics to indigenise their curricula. Jo and I chatted, and we realised that we could actually help each other. We had a lot in common with what we were hoping to achieve. So we actually started hosting some yarning circles with other academics to discuss and give guidance on indigenising curriculum. And it was through these yarning circles that two things really started to crystallise for me. The first is that the terms embedding Indigenous knowledges and indigenising the curriculum, they're often used interchangeably, but we came to realise that they actually mean different, albeit inextricably linked things. Embedding Indigenous knowledges is just that, is making Indigenous voices and perspectives available to students in teaching. While it's a step in the right direction, in the end, that's a pretty superficial exercise if that is the end point. It should be only the first step of indigenising curriculum. So those embedded knowledges need to be integrated into the curriculum in a way that is culturally sensitive, appropriate, and meaningful. For this to happen, teachers themselves need to be culturally sensitive, aware, and intelligent. They need to have started their own cultural learning journey to be able to guide students on the student's journey. The second realisation that became really clear to me was that libraries have a vital role to play in this space. Indigenous Australians form just over 3% of the population. So getting an Indigenous person to have meaningful involvement in every single classroom is just not feasible. So the vast majority of work to indigenise curriculum has to be done by non-Indigenous academics. So how can academics get their students access to Indigenous voices without having an actual Indigenous person in the room? Well, by using books, articles, podcasts, videos, and information sources of all types that contain Indigenous knowledges. And where can these information sources be found? Well, in libraries. It's kind of what we do, access to information. And this is why building library collections that promote Indigenous content are so important. But we also teach information literacy. So how to critically evaluate information, make sure that information sources are credible, authoritative, and appropriate for any setting. And this is especially important when finding culturally appropriate Indigenous voices, as doing so takes us out of our comfort zones of academic authoritativeness and credibility. We have to move beyond the safety blanket of peer review. These two light bulb moments went hand in hand to really resolve not just the role and the responsibility libraries have in Indigenising curriculum, but also the scope of the help that we could provide. So yes, we can help academics source culturally appropriate Indigenous voices to embed into their teaching. As I said, that is at the core of library business. But the wider responsibility of cultural learning of academics falls to the university, and Flinders has projects in the works for this. So the library is just a cog in that machine. So recognising our scope and the limits of it was a godsend, because we then knew we didn't have to deliver the whole world. With some quick discussions with our team, we came up with a plan of action to provide culturally appropriate resources to academics. And luckily, we already had a well-established service in the library to source readings for academics in one place that we could quite quickly adapt.
All right. So basically, the service that Tim is referring to here when he talks about this well-established service is what we call our online content service. Essentially, it's finding resources for academics to include in their readings list. We've also decided amongst our team, it's a service that really needs a better name to describe it. Well, we can never seem to come up with one, so if anyone has any ideas, you know where to find me. So the online content service originally began in response to COVID, when teaching was all moving to fully online. So the library initiated this to assist teaching staff who needed to quickly pivot to fully online learning, who perhaps weren't already doing that. So we offered a service where we would find online resources for them to include in their readings list to replace things like your physical only textbooks. So it would be ebooks, articles, videos, podcasts, all sorts of things, whatever it was that the academic wanted to include within their suggested resources. So the service continued well beyond COVID, and it's a bit of a poorly kept secret, I think, at the university. So the academics who are aware it exists are often really thrilled that it does and that we can do this work for them, because it often is a huge chunk of their time. And most of the academics at Flinders, and I'm sure at pretty much all of the universities, are quite time poor as well. So the fact that we can do some of this work for them is amazing, and many of those academics are also repeat customers, and then we tend to get more and more work through word of mouth from those academics as well who enjoy the service. So we generally get between about 60 and 70 requests for this service per year, and when I last checked the stats earlier this week, we'd have 47 so far this year. And what are we, halfway through September? So essentially, with the online content service job, what happens with it is that an academic will put in a request using an online form. Once we've received that, a senior librarian within the team arranges a meeting with them to talk over and see exactly what it is that they would like and what they need, and who their target audience is for their readings list as well. So we ask questions about what kind of format they'd like the resources in, and who their students are. Obviously, the resources we provide are going to be vastly different between, you know, first-year undergrads or higher-level master's students, or if they're offshore students who live in a different country, because that affects what they can access as well. Also things like how many students are in the topic, in case there are limited license agreements and that kind of thing, which is such a bugbear for me, but that's okay. And all that information helps us narrow down our search and make sure we can provide a list of resources that's really curated towards that cohort. So the kinds of requests that we get go from finding, for example, all new material for a brand new topic that's just been developed, through to doing like a bit of a refresh of a topic, which maybe hasn't had much love for a few years. So for example, topics that, you know, each semester or each year they're being taken on by a different academic to coordinate them. And so things sometimes, you know, get a little bit outdated because the new academic is not aware of what's already there. So since we already had this well-established service, we decided to include a more specific option, as Tim mentioned. So we updated the online content request form in January of this year to include an option to receive support for embedding Indigenous knowledges. So basically, it's just an additional option on an already existing online form, and it just has a little sentence outlining how we can support with finding Indigenous knowledges and perspectives and authored content. So it was an easy enough update for us to do, so we decided that was probably a pretty good start. So we didn't really anticipate the popularity of what this service could end up being. So after an initial communications push to the various colleges within the uni, we've had 18 jobs requesting this since the start of the year. Which has been great, but it's also been really tricky to kind of update our service positions and learning as we go, while also simultaneously providing the service as well. So I myself am still very much in that beginner mindset of that conscious incompetence, which honestly just feels like the story of my life in every facet, but that's okay. And I've also only worked in an academic setting at all for 3 years. So a lot of this is still very new to me as it is. So I know that I personally have a lot to improve on as well. So we've been using the IATSIS guide to resource selection and evaluation to assist us, but this has had its own challenges that we found along the way as we're trying to work to use it within the specific context that we get requests for. And as has been mentioned by quite a few people throughout today, as librarians, we do really tend to be afraid to make mistakes. And sometimes we want more hand-holding than what a guide can give us.
So the IATSIS guide it provides an overarching framework for selecting and evaluating information resources. If you aren't familiar with the framework, it basically consists of a 5-tiered pyramid that describes the spectrum of appropriateness and authority of Indigenous information resources. So at the top of the pyramid is resources that are created by Indigenous authors, that's labelled as by mob. Next, below that, you've got with mob, and then below that, you've got for mob. So these are resources created in partnership or on behalf of Indigenous communities. Below that, you've got about mob, and these are resources that are created about Indigenous peoples, but without any of their input or support. And below that, even further, you have against mob, and those are resources that contain views that are racist, deficient, or outdated. So this pyramid gives us a way of critically evaluating the appropriateness of any given information resource. But applying this pyramid structure in practice has presented challenges that we really weren't anticipating. So the top tier of the framework, the by mob, is the holy grail of what we're searching for, because in there it provides students with direct engagement with Indigenous voices. But the problem we've been finding is, how can you actually tell if an information resource is Indigenous authored or not? Authors do not always provide this admittedly personal information within the resource itself, and it can, and rightfully so, be hard to track that information down online. So we've tried doing Google searches for the author, try and find out, see what else they may have written, or some biographical information about them somewhere, which is very similar to how we would try to establish, for example, whether an academic is qualified to speak on a given topic. But there is a world of difference between trying to find someone's academic history and someone's cultural background or identity. Trying to search for this information just feels wrong. There are, quite serious ethical issues here. Potentially incorrect negative assumptions could be made about someone. And look, we really want to provide academics with resources from that top tier, the by mob tier of the pyramid. But at the end of the day, sometimes we just don't know if we're doing that or not. And it can be just as difficult to tell whether a given resource has been written with mob or for mob, as again, this information isn't always easily discoverable. And we don't want to automatically assume that a resource is written without any Indigenous input whatsoever, as this can have implications for the potential impact and usefulness of a resource in teaching. And we definitely don't want to perpetuate the long history of white people speaking for First Nations, as it doesn't really foster reconciliation or truth-telling. So our solution has been to not fixate or over-research the identity of the author if we feel it's moving beyond the realms of integrity and reason. But making this judgment call can be difficult, as we are non-Indigenous librarians who are relatively new to this work. So when we give the list of suggested resources to academics, we make sure to tell them which resources we know are by, with, or for mob, and which we aren't sure about. We hope to provide as much information as we can to allow them to make informed choices about which resources to use. At the end of the day, the Access Guide provides a great framework for us to work within, but it can be hard to determine which tier information resources fit into.
So alongside that as well, we offer our online content service for all disciplines and topics taught at Flinders, which can be challenging as it is already. And finding Indigenous authors across all fields also amplifies that challenge as well. So we are generalist librarians, we are not liaison or subject-specific librarians at Flinders. So we often need to develop an understanding of those fundamental concepts within the existing curriculum first, before we can then start to make those connections between Western knowledge frameworks and First Nations ways of knowing as well. And searching for Indigenous authored material is really rewarding, and when you do find it, it's a chef's kiss moment, absolutely love it. But the reality remains that sometimes it's a more straightforward process for some academic areas and disciplines than others. And our own backgrounds have an impact here as well, of course. Not just with our own ways of being brought up and, you know, some of that cultural competency, but just what we've studied previously as well. So, for example, our colleague Kayla, who isn't here today because she's travelling around Europe, I'm not jealous at all, it's fine. She has a humanities background, so she feels a lot more confident sourcing perspectives in areas related to literature and language and history, whereas my original background is in science. So, for someone like Kayla, for example, not only is she potentially someone with a humanities background trying to think back to high school biology to remember what mitosis is, if it's like a science topic or something, but she might also be working in an area that can be more difficult to find different perspectives, because sometimes people within certain disciplines can be more resistant to the integration of non-Western knowledge systems. So, you know, it's that perception of, for example, you know, this is right, this is science, this is how it works, don't try and tell me anything else. And that's, again, coming from someone with a science background. So far with this service, we've had jobs for all kinds of topics, so particularly within medicine and palliative care, social work, biology. The one we were weirdly most excited about was a mathematics one, because we knew that was going to be quite challenging. And also we get a lot of palliative care jobs, and sometimes they get a little bit depressing to do one after the other, so it's nice to have a little bit of a break too. So we want to make sure that the information we find is relevant and meaningful to the topic, that the service doesn't unintentionally become that real tokenistic box-ticking exercise for academics, which of course there is a risk of that happening. Thankfully, so far, all of the academics who I have had these conversations with have really been on the same page as us in this regard. And they ask for our assistance, not as a means of just being like, just get it done, chuck it in my readings list, but because they want it to be done well and respectfully, and they acknowledge that as librarians and information professionals, we're probably well placed to try and help them find some of this stuff as well. So despite what we found challenging so far and some of the discomfort we've had in trying to approach this work in a way that is good and works well, we have had positive feedback from academics, which is great, and I think kind of affirms that our work in these areas should continue, and we really need to continue to push beyond our own professional comfort zones and that kind of thing to keep being able to improve this and get better and better over time and acknowledge some of the limitations and that kind of thing as well. So some of this has also raised questions of how much the library itself can provide. So, for example, some of the requests we receive go well beyond the scope of librarian support, and they fall more under things like curriculum development, which really needs to be a college or university-wide consideration. Or in some instances, there are courses with not a lot of wiggle room in terms of what they can include or alter or change, because there are courses, for example, with associated accreditation. So there's not a lot of room for movement there sometimes. So we're also very incredibly aware that we don't want to cause harm. So the information that we share can have real impact. And we can recommend resources, but we can't always control how they're going to be received by academics and students as well. And I think a few people had covered some of this earlier as well. So it was nice to hear people talking and go, oh, yeah, we've had some similar experiences there. That's good to know that, you know, we do have some of these common common issues and goals and that kind of thing too. So for example, when Kayla was excuse me, working on that mathematics job recently, she found some really excellent resources on YouTube, but she also found that, of course, with YouTube being a public platform, I mean, the comment section, if you've ever looked at the comment section of anything online, it's not always dandy. So there were some really racist public comments on there. And so we chose to highlight these to the academic to make him aware of it so that he could sort of actively address them and denounce them in class if he chose to use that resource, and that we weren't just giving this to him blind. And he was really appreciative of this because he said he wouldn't have thought to check the comment section and he wouldn't have seen them, and he was concerned that being a mathematics topic of primarily young first-year male undergraduates, he was concerned that they would be more likely to perhaps take on some of these really negative comments. And another example, we had a request to seek information for a medicine topic as well. So the majority of the journal articles I could find about that relevant to the subject were about the prevalence of, for example, chronic kidney disease in Indigenous populations. So, and that's really important information for medical students to be aware of as they begin to go into practice. But I didn't necessarily feel comfortable providing those resources as they were without knowing if the academic, for example, was going to provide further context to their students about this, because the articles themselves weren't actively including that perspective as the focus was on the pathology of the kidney disease. So, for example, was the academic going to have the information or even the time within their curriculum to, be able to speak to things like societal health gaps and how different populations and minority groups can be impacted by this kind of thing as well. Or if those resources were going to be provided purely as is, was that going to unintentionally provide a kind of reductive narrative as to what is clearly a really, really complex area? So, I mean, ultimately, in making suggestions of materials to be included in these topics, we do have a professional responsibility to ensure our practice doesn't cause harm as much as possible. And clearly, we're all gathered here today. Something like that is a really constant work in progress that we have to continue to improve on all the time.
Looks like we're about to get the wrap up. So I'll just quickly finish off by saying that the service that we're providing is only now predicted to grow in terms of its demand. So we're in the process of writing a project plan, despite what Roxanne was talking about this morning. And the scope of this plan is basically to get training for our team and other library staff to develop their skills in this area, so that we have better knowledge and confidence in the resources that we are providing to academics, but also to develop some self-help resources for academics so they can develop their own skills in finding and evaluating Indigenous voices, and also to continue to hold more yarning circles, as having direct face-to-face conversations with academics we find is often the best way to get them started on their cultural journey. And finally, I just want to say that we are very proud and privileged to be able to work in this space and be able to use our librarian skills and training to contribute to reconciliation at Flinders. It's definitely a huge learning journey for us. It's definitely taken us out of our comfort zones, and it's made us reevaluate what we knew about ourselves and about our information skills. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim and Amy. Well done. I mean, that's some very relevant stuff in there for us as well, which I'll probably talk about in the next session. Our next session is we have Dr. Summer May Finley from University of Wollongong, and she's going to join us online to present Indigenous Perspectives Matter, the development of a curated Indigenous resource database. Summer May is a Yorta woman who grew up in Awabakul country, Westlake Macquarie, and she's currently the senior lecturer at the University of Wollongong, among other roles. You're okay there, Summer?
I am. I'm here. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And before I start, I just want to acknowledge I'm currently on Dharawal country of the Wadi Wadi people here in beautiful Wollongong. As a Yorta Yorta woman, this is not my country. So I am eternally grateful for those that have looked after this country and for those that continue to look after this country. This is country that has become special to me. I live, work, I birthed my two girls here, and I also work here at University of Wollongong. I can't see if the slides are up. It looks like the Flinders slides are up. Are we able to put up my slides? Fantastic. Thank you very much. So we're talking about a similar process, I suppose, to what was just discussed actually, but we're taking a slightly different tack to it. So can I just actually first say I'm presenting on behalf of a fabulous team. Miss Nadia Neal was going to present with me today, but of course, unfortunately, her son is sick. But the other members of the team are Margie, who is with the library, is a non-Indigenous woman, Catherine Moyle, who is an Aboriginal woman, Tammy Small is an Aboriginal woman, and James is a non-Aboriginal man, and Nadia is Aboriginal. So we actually have a strong Aboriginal representation in our team, which is what we were really looking for when we put this team together. Can we just move on to the first slide, please? Thank you. Just give you a bit of background about this project. So what we're seeking to do is create a curated list, database of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander resources from the library. The idea behind this is that we want to preference Indigenous voices, and I'll get to that in a minute. And we're using a curated list because we're calling it a curated list, largely because we can't expect this to be an exhaustive list. What we really want to do is focus on good, solid articles, books, etc., and artefacts that really represent Indigenous voices in a strengths-based approach. There's a history here. So we had a pilot and we were very kindly received an Informit grant. The collaboration is one of the strongest parts of this particular project. One of the other components that is the strength of this is that it's got Aboriginal academics in it as well as the fact that it was built on an existing pilot. So if you could just move to the next slide, that would be great. So why? And it's not dissimilar to what we were talking, what the previous presenters were talking about. So Miss Nadia Neal and I, we work in the School of Health and Society, and as Aboriginal academics, we were constantly asked to review peer-reviewed articles in particular that were being included in curriculum. And we were finding that for a lot of the stuff that was actually being included, while there was elements of it that was actually really good, there were things that often, for example, reinforce negative stereotypes. And it was what the last presenters were talking about. Despite the fact there were strengths in it, the weaknesses weren't necessarily able to be addressed within the space of a tutorial or a lecture, or quite frankly, the academics didn't have the skill set or confidence to be able to do that. So we decided we were going to pull together a list of health-related resources. What we're hoping to do with this expanded list is support academics to move beyond their current knowledge and expertise, to really be thinking about the list we put forward, why it's useful, how it's useful, and what is considered best practice within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander space. We really want to make sure that we're preferencing Indigenous views when we're talking about Indigenous peoples. Why? Well, we know our communities best, and anyone who's a non-Indigenous person is really only thinking about it from their own their paradigm, from their own knowledge base. So it's really important that when we actually have articles in this, and I'll show you a matrix which shows you how we're preparing to curate this list. And we really want to enable educators not to build in just curriculum, but as I said, build appropriate content into the curriculum, or students to use appropriate resources in their articles, but it's also then as a learning opportunity. So we're going to ask academics who are currently using Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander resources in their class to have a look at the matrix, which I will show you soon, to help actually populate our curated list. This matrix will help them understand what would be considered appropriate from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander point of view. Because as the last presenters pointed out, for the vast majority of academics, they're non-Indigenous. We are 3% of the population, and it's not reasonable to expect us to do this work by ourselves. So we have to be able to provide guidance, and we actually have to build people's capability and confidence in this space. And we really want to promote an alternative epistemologies and value those epistemologies, because we all know that university structures are built on a Western epistemology and construct. And we really want to make sure that knowledge and knowledge production is viewed from a variety of different ways, including Indigenous perspectives. The additional benefit of this, of course, is that we can amplify the Indigenous researchers and knowledges across the university. Next slide, please. So just a bit of a history, and I think history is always really important. So we spent a fair bit of time, myself and Nadia, along with Georgie, who's not listed on here. Georgie started this process with the library, and unfortunately he left. So Nadia and I continued with this. We spent about a year working with the library on getting their head around specifically curating a list and what that would look like. Part of that time, of course, was spent because they were updating their back end, which meant there was a new program that we then had to think about how this looked like. So we then piloted the resources and we focused on health related topic matters, because that's my background, is public health, and same with Nadia. In that phase, we used Leganto and we used a list in there, which is one of the functions. The pilot then led to us seeking a grant to expand this particular project. So that's when we put in an application to the Informit grant. And we're now looking to expand it to 2 faculties. So our faculty is the Arts, Social Science and Health, and we're also looking to do it to the Faculty of Health as well. Now, in the Faculty of Arts, Social Science and Health, we have everything from journalism to geography to occupational health and safety, social work. We also have education, psychology. We have a range of health and non-health related matters. So it's definitely going to be a much broader list. We have Indigenous studies. We have a huge range of disciplines within our faculty. So it's definitely going to be a very big task and a very broad approach and a very broad curated list. Could you move to the next slide, please? Just going to give you a snapshot, and I kind of gave you a summary in the beginning, but what we're looking to do is there's 3 aspects of this. So we're looking at developing the process, designing the database, and promoting the resources. The process is going to be something I'll take you through, and that is something we've been working on. This is a work in progress, as most things are. The design of the database is also something that's been underway, and once that's all completed, we'll be promoting it. But we are doing the soft promotion at the moment, but I'll get to that. If you can move to the next slide, please. So in terms of the protocols, we're building on the protocols that were developed as part of phase 1 when it was just myself and Nadia. And we're thinking about how do we actually make sure that this is replicatable across multiple schools and 2 faculties. So we're designing a selection tool, which is a matrix, and I'll show you what that looks like soon. We're thinking about inclusion and exclusion in that. We're thinking about defining the terms to ensure that everybody's on the same page. And the matrix will be the tool. And we're also going to create a user guide, which will include the definitions, but also other tips on how to use this so that we're all being consistent in the way that we approach it. And we really want to enable collaborative conversations with Indigenous staff to support the terms and wording in the assessment. It's really important that even though we've got an Indigenous team on this, that we're inclusive of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics and professional staff to make sure that it's reflective of how they see the inclusion, exclusion, and the importance of those particular aspects. In terms of the selection process, we're working on that. So we've got a draft matrix. At this point, what we're considering is that we will ask all academics, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to submit articles using Qualtrics. So what we'll do is we'll create a survey based on the matrix, and we'll be asking people to then respond to that survey. The survey will be a Likert scale if we're using the current matrix approach, and that Likert scale will then pop out at the end a result in terms of a number. What we'll then do is we'll take that and we'll upload it to Covidence for all of the ones that hit a certain number, and we haven't actually decided on what that looks like yet. We'll upload those articles to Covidence because we want to make sure that, particularly if it's non-Indigenous people answering these questions, that they are thinking about them in the way Indigenous people would think about it. When they're in Covidence, we'll have reviewers look at those particular articles. Indigenous reviewers and make sure that they do align with what we're expecting before they're added to the database. This is a process by seeking non-Indigenous people in particular and academics who are using Indigenous content. We'll be able to actually reduce the workload on Indigenous people specifically, but also provide an opportunity for education for non-Indigenous people if their articles actually don't meet what we would expect them to meet. And I think that's a really important feedback loop. We want to make sure that moving forward, people are enabled to actually identify more appropriate articles, books and resources without heavily relying on their Indigenous academics. And of course, these mechanisms will be set up to ensure that we are there's ongoing maintenance. So haven't figured out whether it'll be reviews monthly, etc. But we'll get to a point where hopefully this just becomes part of business. If you could just move to the next slide, please. Sorry, could you just move to the next slide? Thank you. So if you can have a look at this tool, we've actually got a number of different criteria that we're looking at. So we're looking at authorship, so they self-identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. Now, the advantage of having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people involved in this process is that we often, know who's who. And we talk about 2 degrees of separation rather than 6 degrees of separation. So we often know who's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, particularly because we do have academics across a range of disciplines at the university. We want a strengths-based approach. Strengths-based, and we'll be defining this obviously, is it's countering the deficit discourse, and it is contextualising some of the negative stereotypes by talking about some of the social determinants, for example. We'll be thinking about what the standpoint or paradigm is, so have people identified their standpoint and paradigm. We want it to be actively anti-racist and actually culturally safe. And we want it to be of benefit to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as defined by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we're also looking at its adherence to Indigenous data sovereignty. And I'll take you through the matrix now. So if you could just move to the next slide. Sorry. I think you've moved through 2 slides. Could you go back for me, please? So this is the matrix. When we're thinking about this, absolutely, since it's going to be an Indigenous curated list with prioritising Indigenous knowledges, we'll be excluding anything that does not have an Indigenous author. Now, just because it's got an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander author doesn't necessarily mean it makes it into the list. That's no disrespect to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues, but we want to make sure that we're really talking about the strong, strengths-based research. This is about a curated list, like you could imagine. And we use the word curated because we're thinking about it in terms of like a art exhibition. The artist may have done a whole bunch of really amazing work, but we're really focusing on a particular approach when we curate an art exhibition, which is the same here. We want to make sure that there is at least one Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander author, but we also know, I'm a co-chair of an ethics committee and I see this all the time, where you get one Aboriginal person on a research project and they're quite junior, so we know that they have very little agency over the outcome of that research. We want to make sure that beyond that as well, if there is relevant communities involved, that they've actually been involved in this research, and that's partly to make sure that it is of benefit to them. When we're thinking about strengths-based, we want to avoid deficit language. So anything that uses deficit language will not be included. That includes things like reinforcing negative stereotypes. So we want to make sure that there is an explanation around the social, political, cultural factors that have influenced whatever it is we're talking about: health, education, justice, etc. If you can move to the next slide, please. Again, thinking about the standpoint paradigm, we really want people to outline where they're coming from. I'm a Yorta Yorta woman. I didn't grow up on country. I'm of a certain age. I'm a mum. So thinking about the relevance to their research, because Aboriginality in and of itself is not a qualification, it's a lived experience. We bring a unique perspective and we bring our cultural perspective, but we also want to make sure that the right Aboriginal people are involved in the studies to make sure that they're actually able to, as Martin Nakata would say, talk back to the disciplines. So really understanding that there is a clear standpoint and paradigm in there that's outlined is what we're looking for. As I said, it needs to be culturally safe. It needs to be anti-racist. I don't think I need to explain that. If it's not culturally safe, it's definitely not making it on the curated list. Again, the use of stereotypes, or if you're using the word Aboriginal to mean Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, or God forbid, people are still using ATSI, and if they are, they're definitely not operating in a culturally safe way. So if they're using any terminology that is not deemed as appropriate, and this is something I'm very passionate about and I actually have written about, that will be excluded. And then benefits to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, we all know research doesn't necessarily translate to direct benefits to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but there has to be some sort of recognition that this has benefits as defined by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And then thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty. So when it's involving research, for those that aren't really aware of Indigenous data sovereignty, what this is that Indigenous peoples have been involved in all aspects of the research from start to the end. What this means is that it's of benefits as defined by Indigenous people, but beyond that, it is about what's been collected, how it's been collected, and why it's been collected, and Indigenous knowledge is built into every aspect of that. Indigenous data sovereignty is a movement that is certainly becoming more widespread, and we're certainly seeing more and more research adhering to this, but there's still a lot that's not. And if researchers aren't actually thinking about that, then they won't make it onto our fabulous curated list. If we could just move to the next slide, that would be great. A lot of information here, a lot of text. So the way it's going to look in terms of the development of the database is we're going to use a tagging function. So this is going to be a tagging function that's specifically for this resource. The library has made sure that the only people that will have access to this tagging function are the project team and a small number of people in the library. So we'll be looking at keywords tags for each of these. So what we want to do is actually make sure that people can search for things, much like you traditionally search for things in a library, but search for things specifically on the database. And so that way you might want to look at youth and justice. You can look up those tags and you'll get a small curated set of articles that you know then are from an Indigenous perspective. This is really important. We're going to have a discoverable interface, which I'll show you at the moment. We're hoping to make this available, we'll make this available to the public, pending obviously whether or not it's open access. So all the public will absolutely see the list and will obviously be able to access any articles that are open access in that. And we will actually be prioritising open access in there as well. What we want to make sure is that in terms of benefit, that actually community can see and read the research that may or may not be of benefit to them. Thinking about the Aboriginal community controlled health organisations, there's a lot of research that would benefit them in terms of their advocacy for community or design of programs for their community. And if it's behind a paywall, that makes it really difficult for non-academics. And it's really important for us that then that can be shared on Moodle sites. If you could just move to the next slide, that would be great. So this is some of the mock-ups. Now, this is all a work in progress. So this is a draft. So this is some examples of the technology. So when we're looking at it, you will get, we're going to have a web page which will bring up some of the most popular keywords, etc. We're thinking about seeing if we can change the image of the tags to have an Aboriginal icon. If you can just move to the next one. Thank you. And we're actually, so people can type in their search words in this function to make it like you would. So it's going to function like a library database normally does, because we wanted to make sure that we were using existing infrastructure, which people are familiar with. We all know if we have to learn a new system or if we have to think too hard about a new approach, it's just not going to get done, right? So we wanted to make sure that it was similar enough that people felt comfortable to use it and access it in a traditional way. So you could just move on to the next one. And then, of course, it'll pull up the articles just like it does on a normal library database. So people aren't going to necessarily, as I said, have to think about how this is used. So this is the Indigenous Knowledges collection. You can see just below the page where it's got all of the tags, and that's how it separates it from, and it indicates that these are the categories that are appropriate from an Indigenous point of view. All right, next slide, thank you. Promotion and uptake. There is no point absolutely doing a resource that nobody knows about. We're talking about a range of different things. We are hoping to have a physical exhibition where we will actually blow up and like artwork these resources. We have a space in the building that I'm in, building 29, that is an exhibition space. We'll of course be writing media articles about this through UOW's The Stand, The Conversation. True to academic nature, we'll be doing peer-reviewed articles, social media. So we're actually going to really try and saturate the market on this because, quite frankly, we really want this to make sure it has an absolute uptake. Beyond this as well, we'll be having opportunities to speak to people, invite ourselves, which I have no shame in doing, to people's school and faculty meetings to promote this, be having one-on-one meetings if we have the time and capacity. But really making sure that we can do this well and promote it extensively so this actually gets used. And of course, one of the ways we'll be doing this is through a launch. It's really important that we have that kind of, we'll have a soft launch and have it piloted, and then of course we're going to have the broader launch, which will hopefully link to the exhibition. We just need to find some funding for that particular exhibition and that launch. That's really all I have in relation to this. I just want to say that, you know, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics, having the opportunity to work with the library to create a resource like this in the long run is going to do the two things the other speakers talked about, which is both Indigenising curriculum, but also decolonising, because we're getting people to think differently by getting them to critique the articles that they're currently using and submitting to this resource. But then obviously we're influencing curriculum. And essentially, from my point of view as an Aboriginal woman, when we have professionals that leave this university with a degree that are better placed to work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we're actually going to see better outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, no matter what space it is: health, law, psychology, education. And ultimately, that is absolutely worth it. So we are very grateful to Informit to enabling us to do this grant. If you just move to the next slide, we just have one last, which is our contacts. If you'd like to speak to any of us, including myself, please take down our email addresses. We are always happy to chat, always available, and hopefully we can promote this resource to all of you once it's finalised. Thanks very much. That's me.
Thanks, Summer May. That was brilliant. It's great to see the project actually evolve to where it is. We had a bit of a preview a while ago, but it's just progressed so well. In fact, it looks pretty good too. It's given us a lot of hints, was giving me a lot of hints about what we can do with our platform as well. I should have made a point before. We'll leave questions to last after this next presentation, which is also an online presentation. So we have Yasmin Hall and Michaela Hill to present a cultural safety project at Charles Sturt University Library. Yasmin Hall is Client Services Librarian at Charles Sturt University Library, fostering inclusive environments. And Michaela Hill also works at Charles Sturt University Library and currently is the metadata and repository, in the metadata and repository team.
Thank you so much. Can you hear us?
We can hear you, but not see you.
Oh,
okay. We've turned our cameras on.
Oh, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. No worries.
Yeah, so we've got a slideshow if we can find that. But thank you for thanks for having us today. I just wanted to say that we're coming to you from Wiradjuri country in New South Wales, so we're at Bathurst. And we'd like to pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and all the First Nations people watching the symposium today. So we do have a slide presentation.
That's it.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. Rightio. So in 2022, we began a cultural safety project here at CSU in the library, focusing on the experiences of First Nations students in our spaces. So we collaborated with the Charles Sturt University's First Nations Student Success team, and we spent 6 months chatting with First Nations staff and students, and this led to over 60 recommendations for change being agreed on in our library. So since then, we've worked to improve cultural safety for First Nations students in many areas across our physical and online library and learning commons areas, in our collection, in our learning objects that we create, and in our services.
So to get started, we looked at simple changes we could make in our libraries. We have a permanent First Nations authored book display in each of our campus libraries that changes for important cultural events throughout the year. Could you just move to the next slide, please? Thank you. We evaluated how our library describes First Nations materials and decided on what we could change to ensure respectful and accurate representation and description. Cultural warnings were added to our library homepage, and that's what you can see on the screen at the moment, and to our discovery layer and student reading lists in Leganto. Any of our existing call numbers on our physical books that ended in ABO, we changed that to a suffix of ABOR. Next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. Oh, that's
I think we've just got to go back a slide.
Yeah.
We've missed one.
Is it possible to go back one, please? If not, that's fine.
Oh, we can move on to this
Okay.
one. So
Yeah. No,
we'll let Mick finish what she's talking about.
Cultural warnings were then added to individual records for relevant items found by searching for Library of Congress subject headings such as Indigenous Peoples Australia, Aboriginal Australians, and Torres Strait Islanders. You can, I'm not sure, I don't think you can see it, but we have a slide, had a picture of our diversity, equity and inclusion statement, and that's been added to every record to acknowledge that the standard vocabularies we use to describe resources could cause harm, and that we're working to rectify this. We also added a right of reply into our web pages and online catalogue using Primo's report and issue button.
And the right of reply lets our students and staff, all our patrons, report an issue with any of our items or any of our subject headings in our Primo records. So they might see a book that shouldn't be there, or they might see a subject heading that they don't like, and they can use that right of reply option. So we're hoping you can see the slide with our First Nations Knowledges collection. So this collection was created to highlight the First Nations authored resources and knowledges in our collection. So we've also created a library guide to go with this collection, which shows people how we choose resources for the collection and allows people to suggest titles or question titles if they like. So every book in this collection has had the metadata updated, which we'll be showing you in a minute. And the sub-collections pictured on this page were agreed upon with First Nations staff in line with our areas of teaching. So next slide, please. So this slide shows, basically we had some suggestions from elders and First Nations staff for more sub-collections. So we've added 3 more sub-collections into our knowledges collections on topics that are important to our communities. And these include the stolen generations, missions and reserves, and colonial wars and massacres. So we're just starting now to populate these with the resources because they're fairly new collections. So we now have a First Nations authored collecting priority after liaising with our First Nations student success teams and our School of Indigenous Australian Studies academics. This gave us title recommendations and areas to collect in, and we also use the title alerts options in Alma to catch new publications. Okay, next slide, please. So another thing that we've tried to do at CSU to highlight the continuing importance of First Nations knowledges is add searches for First Nations knowledges such as land management, astronomy, cultural burning, and water management into our online library workshops and our information literacy classes. We're hoping that this will familiarise students with these ideas while they're learning how to use our ebooks and search in our databases and use EndNote. Next slide, please.
So now I'm just going to talk about some of the changes that we made in Alma, which is our library management system that we use here at Charles Sturt. So we're adding AustLang codes to 041 fields in our MARC record. So that is in that bottom left screen. You can see there the 041 field and our AustLang code, D10 for Wiradjuri. And we've separated IACS's subject headings to acknowledge this is intellectual property and label these First Nations IACSs. We're adding IACS's subject codes to 650 fields and IACS's place names to 651 fields. So you can see in the top left screenshot is the 650s at the top for the subjects, and then down the bottom is the 651s for the place names. We're investigating using a 545 field when authors give information about their country and ancestry, and we're looking at the 700 field as a way of recording storytellers and other contributors. So all of this has become business as usual for new acquisitions, and we're testing ways of doing bulk changes on certain topics in our existing collection, such as our dreaming titles or titles on the stolen generations. When we update item records, we're not removing or hiding any existing fields in an effort to integrate truth-telling into our cataloguing. And I think that's something that came up in the panel earlier. And I guess that's kind of our way, Charles Sturt, what we've decided to do. And we've also got that diversity, equity and inclusion statement as well. We realise that reparative description is an evolving process, and we know we're just beginning our learning journey. As ideas change, we plan to consult with First Nations staff and students and update our practices based on advice from GLAM, peak bodies and communities of practice. Okay. Next slide, please.
Thank you. So recently we've begun working on identifying secret and sacred First Nations knowledges in our collections. At a recent QLOC Indigenous Strategy Community of Practice meeting that Charles Sturt's a part of, a list of titles that contained secret knowledges was shared. And our library had multiple copies of nearly every title on the list, so we really needed to start investigating how to work with these titles. So all the identified titles were removed from our shelves for assessment, and we're now working with local elders, our First Nations Student Success team and our Pro Vice Chancellor for First Nations Engagement to create safe storage and avenues of access to these books. So by doing this work, we're hoping to prevent harm to Charles Sturt staff, students and our local communities, but we're also hoping to respect protocols around the storage of and access to culturally sensitive materials and safeguard those secret and sacred First Nations knowledges from inappropriate use. And we're starting to work on, we were recently approached by a Bathurst elder and asked to help promote a new thesis written by a First Nations researcher. So we're investigating ways we can amplify the First Nations excellence in research in the Charles Sturt research repository. Testing so far has looked at adding new labels into our repository and possibly creating a new special collection in our discovery layer without causing duplication or double handling for our cataloguing staff.
We're looking at the emerging trend of listing country as author and figuring out how community members or elders who collaborate on research can be acknowledged in our records.
And we're also working with our School of Indigenous Australian Studies to create a library guide for Charles Sturt researchers on topics such as First Nations research methods and methodologies, researcher positionality and research ethics, and exploring creating an OER for supervisors working with First Nations researchers. So it's been 2 years now and it feels like we're still learning something new every week and discovering other ways that we can shine a light on First Nations resources or potentially reduce harm to our patrons. So we're hoping that each small change we make is making a difference to our students and communities.
Next slide, please. Thank you. Well, thanks for listening. That's the end of our talk. We're happy to take any questions now if there's time, or otherwise our email addresses are on the screen. So we're happy happy to answer any questions by email. So thank you.
Thanks, Yasmin and Michaela. I think we're kind of pushing the schedule a bit, so maybe we'll skip questions and jump into our next yarn, table yarn. So online, if you could have a look at the Mentimeter. There's a QR code on your table to join that on the tables. But the question we've got for people to chat about is, how could your workplace better include First Nations knowledges and perspectives or improve cultural safety? Spend about 5 minutes on that and then we'll have the next session.
All right, we're going to have to wrap this up quickly. I'm so sorry to do this. I do love to hear all the chatter and the conversation, but I think also everyone will need afternoon tea. All right, we now have two lightning talks. Firstly, Sarah Germain from CAVAL and Lachie Sedaris from Informit will introduce the Informit Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Metadata Review Project. Sarah Germain is the Deputy CEO at CAVAL and has over 15 years experience in working with high-profile systems companies from a diverse range of fields, and Lachie Sedaris is the head of product of Informit with a particular interest in amplifying Indigenous-led research.
Oh yeah, clicker. Hello everybody again. Informit aggregates and hosts a very large collection of Australian humanities and social sciences published content. Included is a large collection of journals, books and videos that are created by or containing information about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. Each year we create over 100,000 component level metadata records for journal articles, book chapters and video program segments. And over 30 years or so, that means we've got a cache of about like over 5 million records, and that's not including all the partner catalogues that we also host. So it's sometimes been described as a sausage factory. Since around 2008, we've collated a specific collection called the Informit Indigenous Collection. It's a database that hosts Australian and New Zealand publications focusing on Indigenous issues around culture, health, education, law, and justice, and so on. Informit has been very conscious of the increasing momentum in the library community to work towards a practice that is reparative and anti-racist. And resources like the guidelines for First Nations description are very important mirrors to gauge how we represent First Nations researchers and research. This symposium speaks directly to the significant focus of this in our own community of librarians and publishers, and is of vital importance that Informit is aligned with this momentum. And Informit is also committed to promoting and celebrating the achievements of Indigenous scholars and amplifying Indigenous-led research. It's a key pillar. So when we embarked on the Indigenous Scholars You Should Know interview series, which we'll highlight at the session after a break, we discovered many works by the scholars which were in Informit databases, just not in the Indigenous collection. They were in literature journals, art journals, legal journals, and so on. Their work did have a First Nations lens, but somehow searching specifically in that collection would not encounter the work. Oh, yep. Sorry. So we're asking the question, if Indigenous authors contribute to publications focusing in areas ranging from art to health to law, is it meaningful for Informit to create a publication into an Indigenous collection? Given the fact that you siloed it, maybe you'll never find it now, because we made that choice of where it belongs. So here you see a couple of records. One is, this is a record by an author, Dr. Eugenia Flynn. It's in a literary magazine called The Lifted Brow. And I mean, she's a prominent Indigenous author, and there's no reference, to her indigeneity. If you were to use that query, it would not result in or return a result. Here's another article by Professor Kathleen Butler, who's also an Indigenous scholar, you should know. The article is obviously about a topic to do with indigenising curricula, yet there's no metadata associated with that. And also, if you were to just use a query, like that's a query that actually borrowed from Barbara Lemon to use in her project to unearth I don't know how many thousands of articles at the NLA, it wouldn't return this work because, well, it's not in there. Even though the word indigenising is there, it didn't. You got to be kind of clever to take into consideration every contingency. So the second question we're asking is, how should Informit metadata be structured or improved to best aid in the discovery of content created by or containing information about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities? And there are some, usually older records, that may include outdated descriptions, or they just be plain wrong. But I'm not going to show you any of them today. So the final question we are asking is, what is the best practice to improve cultural safety and potential strategies for reparation? And just listening to the discussion up to now, it's encouraging to know that even though we're still learning, there's just so much creative thought and work has already taken place. And while quality assurance and specialist cataloguers are very much built into Informit, in some ways it feels like we may be a little bit late to the party. But we're very interested in how today's discussed strategies can be applied to a significant process-driven operation like Informit. I mean, it's great that there is just such a motivated community out there. And to specifically to address these questions, in the context of Informit, we asked our long-term partner, CAVAL, to help us out. So we've embarked on a project to just start working out what the best way forward is to be able to address those questions. And so now Sarah will have a go at addressing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucky. So CAVAL's role. So CAVAL was originally known as a cataloguing agency, allowing for shared resources to be distributed amongst members. As such, we've been able to create a scalable resource that's not just for members, but for anyone that requires expertise, especially in the metadata sphere. Since our project with the University of Melbourne, we have provided a number of consultancies in metadata reviews, including culturally appropriate metadata in the culturally appropriate metadata space. We're also contributors to multiple of national groups from our amazing set of expert cataloguers. Our partnership with Informit has provided a really good opportunity for us to walk the talk, especially when running a symposium like this. So phase one, which is one of two phases, is mostly a discovery phase. We will look at the wide range of points of interest, including the discovery process that is used on the Informit platform, the data entry process of those contributing to the platform, and the documentation, processes and procedures that surround this platform. Phase two, we're actually going to be trying to ascertain what, how, and how long it would take to conduct record enhancements. We'll also conduct the record enhancements themselves and get a bit of an average as to how long this may actually take. This will give us the understanding of how big the project may end up being, so phase three, and also give us an understanding of if there is ways that we can do things in a bulk process. We will provide a full report at the end of this as to the what, how, and how long. What we did want to do was celebrate that Informit is conducting and walking the talk, because it is something that is rare, and it's hard to find a publisher that is willing to do this sort of work. And we think it's a positive step forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Lucky and Sarah. We now have Sarah Brinkage from the Parity Council to Homeless Persons to fill us in about After the Voice, First Nations Response to Homelessness edition of Parity. Sarah Brinkage is the guest editor of Parity's issue after The Voice, First Nations Response to Homelessness. Sarah was going to be joined by Noel Murray, the editor and manager of CHP's monthly publications and Parity magazine, but Noel's unfortunately not here, so you're on your own. Thank you.
Woman Jekka. So I'd like to start going back to Uncle Ronnie's welcome to country and just amplify that his message and the pain he asked us to share is so relevant and important that we recognise the ongoing processes of colonisation. I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri traditional owners of the Kulin Nation. Thank you for being caretakers of this country and sharing the ancient and enduring spiritual connection to land, sky and water that has survived the devastating effects of colonisation. So my quick 10-minute presentation today will be a little bit different because it doesn't have anything to do with metadata, cataloguing, reparative descriptions or library management systems. Sorry. But I do come with a purpose, and I know I'm in a motivated community, and I know that everyone here is advocating for those who are often most marginalised and most vulnerable in community. And this project is about valuing, privileging and amplifying Indigenous perspectives and voices. Each month, Council to Homeless Persons produces Australia's nationwide homelessness edition Parity. I'm here today seeking contributions for our October edition, First Nations Responses to Homelessness. Informit is a proud sponsor and hence our invitation to this event. And university students and libraries who are part of the Informit network can all access the current and back editions of Parity. There's some on the back table there if you want to have a look. Our October edition is an opportunity to bring light to the issues facing community regarding the ongoing effects of colonisation, the psychological toll of dashed hopes from the failed referendum, and the increasing feelings of marginalisation, frustration and distrust of government processes. I'm not going to bombard you today with slides filled with data and statistics. The need for Indigenous data sovereignty is an issue that needs analysis, and I'm a firm believer that data and statistics alone cannot represent the human story and damaging effects of Australia's First Nations homelessness crisis. It is also necessary to articulate the importance of moving beyond typical stereotypes of homelessness. Australia's homelessness demographic is made up of children, elderly, university students, families, and numerous other groups who don't fit the usual stereotype, but who are struggling with the increased cost of living and the housing crisis. I will bring to your attention another fact that cannot be misinterpreted. In Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are the traditional owners and custodians of our land, water and sky. And the people with the greatest hereditary right to this land as their own home are also the group most likely to experience homelessness. I will draw your attention to findings from the Aboriginal community controlled organisation, Victorian Aboriginal Housing, the Malamala Taya Taruk Aboriginal Housing and Homelessness Framework. 1 in 6 Victorian First Nations will experience homelessness each year. And being Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander makes you 13 times more likely to experience living without a safe and secure roof over your head and access to basic rights such as food, clothing and education. This is the devastating state of our homelessness crisis. Colonisation did not only mean the taking of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands or their removal to live on designated missions and reserves, but is an ongoing process today. And ongoing colonisation is realised through processes that result in increased homelessness, over-incarceration, child removal, and housing discrimination. These services, both past and present, have a direct impact on a range of health, safety, and wellbeing outcomes. So, back to my purpose for being here today, to advocate for those most marginalised and most discriminated against. The aim of the October edition, After the Voice, First Nations Responses to Homelessness, is to provide a forum in which as many voices as possible, both organisational, individual and collective, can articulate their views on what should be policy and service response to First Nations homelessness. Parity serves to influence all stages of reform, from ministerial committees, university research centres, training and education providers, and frontline workers in the emergency and temporary social and community housing sector. The magazine values diverse perspectives, lived experience, grassroots advocacy, and artistic forms of expression through poetry, graphics, arts, and songs. CHP is hoping that some of you here today will lend your voice to our October edition and share our call for contributions throughout your network. We are seeking essays, research papers, reflections, opinions, and lived experience dedicated to investigating, analysing, and scrutinising the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community seeking homelessness services and the loss of hope and community cohesion since the failed referendum. Your contributions will strengthen support networks and partnerships and advocate for those working in Aboriginal controlled sectors and mainstream providers to help prevent and end homelessness. I've brought along some previous editions of Parity, which are on the back table there. And like I said, if you're a university scholar and sign in with Informit, you have digital access for free. And the calls for contributions documents, which outlines due dates for submissions and a framework of discussions. So, what is needed? We are seeking contributions that address cultural capacity and competency in the sector. How can the specialist homeless sector ensure it is providing culturally competent frontline emergency and temporary accommodation service workers within a workforce that is burnt out and underpaid? What cultural models of care are critical in the prevention of homelessness and its exacerbation of social and emotional well-being, low social emotional well-being? How can we foreground the necessity to rebuild trust and address past wrongdoings by building upon cultural competency and safety and recognising connection to country in homeless service delivery? We're also asking potential contributors to use this platform as an opportunity to take aim at the liturgy of systematic failures within the criminal justice system, health and correction systems. Ongoing inquests into the deaths into custody shape the landscape of this homelessness emergency. It was recently announced that no charges were laid over Veronica Nelson's death, despite the video footage showing overwhelming and unquestionable evidence of gross negligence to risks to health and safety. How can the specialist homeless sector work with drug and alcohol and other services to challenge and dismantle deficit-driven and racist perspectives and improve the health and safety of those in community? Restoring hope. The 2023 referendum held promise of significant constitutional recognition and empowerment, offering a beacon of hope for positive change and acknowledgement of historical injustices. However, the disappointment resulting from the failure of the referendum to deliver meaningful outcomes has contributed to a sense of betrayal and disconnection. The pressing issue of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander homelessness needs to be addressed within the broader context of treaty negotiation and the restoration of native title. The legacy of racist policies and discriminatory practices rooted in colonisation has contributed to legal frameworks and law enforcement practices with effects persisting today. First Nations overrepresentation in the youth criminal justice institution perpetuates social and economic exclusion, leading to increased risks of homelessness. How can we ensure we are integrating Aboriginal ways of knowing, being and doing to heal the wounds fresh from colonisation and participate in de-incarceration objectives for First Nations children? And connection to country and culture. Connection to country and culture is intertwined with active participation in ceremony practices, language, community ties, and the ancestral spiritual dimensions of existence. What cultural models of care are critical in the prevention of homelessness? And moving into the future, how can we restore self-determination, empower community to shape policies and practices, engage lived experience, and bring together a comprehensive set of community-controlled data that helps hold government to account on whether the combined efforts of ACOs and mainstream services are having an impact. Thank you for listening, and I hope this motivates you to pick up a call for contributions, check out CHP's socials, and maybe someone in your network is interested in this sector and wants to contribute.
Thank you, Sarah. And we actually did want you here to bring something different to today than just around cataloguing and metadata, so we appreciate that. We're going to break now for afternoon tea in the foyer. We're going to still come back at 3:30 to try and stick to our schedule for the rest of the afternoon. We have some Indigenous scholars you should know, excerpts of interviews, and our great final keynote. So have a quick break and we'll see you back soon.
And can you take it out of the foldback? Is that off? Can you take it out of both? Everything? Check, check. Can you hear that? Is that on? That's still on. Check, check.
Hello, testing. Is that working? Maybe a little bit more up. Yep, okay. Thanks, Ellie. Like so. Better? I will. I'm just testing because I haven't actually used one before. This one? Turn it off there.
No, I've been being very cheeky.
Okay. Is it okay?
And you can actually turn it off until you're ready. So
Okay.
just this button here. So now
Is
it's
that loud enough there? Or?
Yeah, I just want to turn it.
Yeah.
That's all. So just turn it off first.
God. Hello, is that working? Yeah. Hello everyone, I hope you saved us from some afternoon tea. Hi, I'm Gretel Taylor. I'm a research consultant for Informit with particular focus on the First Peoples Lens initiatives. One of those initiatives is the Kummargii Yulendji Symposium, and another is the Indigenous Scholars You Should Know interview series. So at Informit, we believe that the proliferation of Indigenous-led research in recent years is among the most exciting developments in Australian research, and we're keen to amplify these contributions. So over the last year and a half or so, we've been interviewing First Nations researchers from diverse fields and at varied career stages. We're also starting to do occasional interviews with knowledge holders you should know, in which we meet elders and knowledge holders who are respected by their communities as keepers of cultural knowledge. We hear about the powerful ways that their knowledge is being revitalised and applied in contemporary contexts and communities. I've been very privileged to interview all of these wonderful people that you can check out on the Informit website. The series is ongoing. We are always on the lookout for more interviewees. So please get in touch if you think that you or someone that you'd like to suggest should be part of the collection. So we're now going to view some brief excerpts of some of the recent interviews with First Nations researchers and knowledge holders, and then we're going to have a discussion with three of the interviewees. Dr. John Doola, who I have here on stage with me, and Brooke Wandon, also here. And we should have Professor Kathleen Butler online, please, who's joining us from Newcastle. Actually, if you can just go to the video now, that would be great, and then bring Kathleen after that. That would be great. Thank you.
Just this morning, I received an email saying that my two reviewers have handed in their reports. So officially Dr. Mandy, but it isn't about that title. It also is about being heard. When you've got that little DR in the front of your name, people start to listen a bit more. And it isn't about becoming or assimilating into that colonial structure of institutions. It's about breaking those barriers and really taking down those colonial structures of invasion and making sure that the right information, the cultural information, is embedded right from the very beginning. And what I mean by that, like, I'm writing a course for third year architect students at Melbourne Uni at the moment, and it's all about getting them out of the classroom, taking them outside, teaching them about simple things like, well, it's not simple, it's really major, but it's something that's often overlooked. What's the difference between a welcome and an acknowledgement? What does it truly mean? How do you design on country? How do you look at country? How do you kind of, in an urban environment, how do you keep your culture alive and make sure that culture continues? And the way that I kind of say it, that everyone can do, is you zone out of all that mad noise that's happening around you, all the trams and the yelling and the horns, and you focus on the important sound. So the important sound could be a little dun-dun or a rainbow lorikeet flying across, and at the moment they're going crazy in the city, finding partners and nests and things like that. So even at home, I'll be having 3 TVs on, and my niece will have music on, and I can still hear that black cocky or that currawong in the far distance, because you tune your listening into nature.
Really, what I'm most passionate about is teaching people about Indigenous cultures, and not specific kind of, dreaming stories, but what is the nature of the dreaming? What is the nature of Indigenous cultures that make them so different from modern cultures? This oral tradition, this embedding of dance and art and weaving and carving in everyday life, the egalitarian nature of these societies where power is distributed, where leaders don't have the authority to compel others to do anything. These are really amazing cultures. People were very fit and healthy in these cultures. Lots of connection, lots of a sense of individual autonomy, or what we call relational autonomy. So very much about people being recognised as autonomous beings, but in relation to others, in deep relation to others. Human and non-human creatures of the earth and the skies and the sea. So I really think that there's so much to learn, and it would be very useful for people to understand how specific their way of going through the world is, and how much more there is out there to draw from.
A light bulb moment for me in thinking about, actually, I have been in lots of ways indoctrinated into another system, but we call it culture, or we don't necessarily think about it, and I was very privileged, I think, to have that ability to have that, to grow up in that way, and to have a sense of a way of being and doing and knowing that is fundamentally Indigenous, that's tied to our sovereignty. And that was important to me. So I think that having that realisation that is a perspective that I bring to how I do my research, but also when I'm reading books, when I'm writing my own text, that's the perspective that I bring was really important. So my PhD research effectively proposes a paradigmatic approach to reading and engaging with our literature, with our text. So looking at kind of 5 books across Indigenous literary history in this context, in the Australian context, looking at those books and reading them from that perspective, from our Indigenous ways of being, knowing and doing. And yeah, just thinking through that as a model for the way that we can read.
So I started to question, what does climate change mean to us as Aboriginal people? And I went back to William Barrack's thoughts and his legacy that still drives me today. Give us this land and we will show you that we can work it. In understanding that climate change is coming. How do I actually prepare this land for climate change? I can't change climate change collectively across Australia, but we are actually preparing for climate change right here on this 200 acres by taking cattle out of the water, by using bore water, by trying to increase the biodiversity of this small block of land so that other small landholders can actually come and learn from us. When the demand and supply, when Coles and Woolworths can't supply us with all of our daily needs that we're so used to, and we overuse and throw away half of it, when people have to go back to learning to grow their own vegetables and fruit and things like that, that where can they learn how to do that? And I'm hoping that we are ready for when that challenge comes, that they can use this place as an example of best land management practice in trying times that humans will face in the near future.
One of my people is the Bundjalung people of northern New South Wales. We have a particular type of tea tree. So if you're familiar with tea tree oil, as many people are, that actually comes from a tree that only grows naturally in the Bundjalung region. And so we have particular knowledges, in particular women's knowledge, around the use of that tree, because it's antibacterial, and where its leaves fall into water, so it tends to grow around, water. Where the leaves fall into the water, it actually infuses that water with health. So when we say things like country makes us healthy, it's not a metaphor, it's an actual practice. And if I was to think about indigenisation of curriculum, I often see that if we look at the body of knowledge that is known as that water source, I think that, Indigenous peoples in our knowledge, we are those leaves that will fall into the water and will infuse it with health.
Yeah, look, history is critically important for us, and I'll re-emphasise that importance. That we were deprived history. We were cut off from history. As I said before, we were told we belonged to the Stone Age and we're a dying race. The reality is we needed to challenge that, and we need to put ourselves back in. It's not just about discoverers and explorers and settlers and Don Bradman and even Phar Lap. Aboriginal people have played a major part in the history of this country and needed to be brought into that space. So these are the stories that I like to see delivered to our communities, our families and our younger generations. But it's not just us, it's non-Indigenous people. They need to be told the truth of what happened in this country across the last 230 odd years, to know the truth about this country and how that history is impacted onto us. But even of greater importance is the fact that this is 65,000 years of history. That is the country's greatest treasure, greatest cultural treasure. That is there to be shared by everybody. And the reality is that's the thing that tourists from overseas want to come and hear about and see. That's what needs to be capitalised on, and that's what needs to be told. And as I said, non-Indigenous people that are largely ignorant of history, they need to be informed of what's happened. Not just the tragedy and horror of what's happened, but also the incredible triumphs, that Aboriginal people have been part of. So that's a really important part of history.
I'm really happy that all of those archives have been protected for a long time. I think that's wonderful. But I also feel quite conflicted because they're sort of all locked up. They're kind of contained. So that's tricky to manage. So I often don't try to think about that. I feel that feeling, gloss over it, get back to the practicality of saying the words, which is really important. But by taking those archives out of their boxes, out of the concrete, out of those sort of very colonial institutions, back into the hearts and mouths of my people is probably one of my most proudest moments. If I hear my cousins speaking in language, if I hear perhaps a child that I've taught from school calling out to me in language in the supermarket, if I hear my grandchildren saying, "Love you, Nan," as they leave in language, that's the aim, right? To hear language and to be able to use it. Actually, even use it incorrectly is fine with me, as long as people are using it.
So the word migration for me, I looked at the migration and I couldn't find a way of explaining that from a cultural perspective in regards to the Torres Strait Islander movement, because it would, from a more Western side, it would mean that we left our home now, that we are no longer connected there, that we're going to build a new life in Australia. And I couldn't see that. If I was to fully go into the idea of the migration, it would mean disconnection and our identity as Torres Strait Islanders. So I explained it more from a cultural perspective now. This is why I used Lubabat Sub, the driftwood, as my metaphor.
So you can see those full interviews and some more on Informit's website. And yeah, they're full of gems like those little tasters that you got there. So I just wanted to start the conversation by asking you, Brooke, if you would introduce yourself briefly and describe your current work or role or a project that you want to share.
Sure. Mamanik Yulendji Dumbunyat, Wawa Naranik Brook Wandon, Gulum by Maimik Bolok Burung Yalingbu, Waranjeri Bagaruk, Waiwang Dumbu Dulap, Narkwarenik Wandun, Ba Narkwarenik Nolan, Lonigan, Kennedy, Kilkenny Island, Bunjul Kummargii Yulendji Symposium Wan Pikarnu. Well, I do lots of different projects that are interesting and meaningful to me. I teach at a local primary school. I play AFL football. Sometimes I make things. I suppose I could call myself an artist. But I think for me today, what I want to talk about is my experience in language revitalisation and in particular around the fellowship I did at the State Library of Victoria in 2022 and yeah, some other related projects.
Thank you so much, Brooke. John, would you like to also introduce yourself and a little bit about what your role is now?
Yep. I would first like to respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, the Kulin Nation, and the land that we are on today. And I respectfully acknowledge their elders, past and present, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in the room and online. So how much time do I have? Okay, so when I graduated with a degree and master's and a PhD, my idea from studying Aboriginal studies was that I wanted to talk about the impact of colonization. That's my general interest in research. The impact of colonization on Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. And at the moment, I'm a Nanga doctoral fellow. So I'll spell the name for you. Nanga is pronounced, Nanga is N-G-A-R-R-N-G-G-A, Nanga. So you can look at the website when you go home. Yeah, so it's about, I'll read an extract from our website. It's led by our director. The Nanga director is Kamilaroi woman, Professor Melita Hogarth. And in Nanga, it's a nation building project led by First Nations educators. We're creating high quality, innovative curriculum, resources for educators. And my lead role is in initial teacher education. And we just started at the moment, beginning. So, and part of the Nanga project, I will be looking at Torres Strait Islander education in the curriculum, Torres Strait Islander knowledge in the curriculum, Australian curriculum. And I guess there's a lot of things that are not taught in schools about Torres Strait. For example, we have a name for the Great Barrier Reef. We call it OPNOR. You don't hear that in school. And our people, they came right down the coast of Cape York. The footprints of our creative spirits on Aboriginal land. The Guguyahu people. Our creative spirit, his name is Gelam. His footprints is there. He walked from Cape York into the Torres Strait. So these are the kind of things that you don't learn, and they should be taught in schools about that connection.
Great. Okay. You'll get more chance to
Okay,
talk
okay,
a
no,
bit more depth in a minute.
I asked
just
for that.
want to say hello and welcome to Professor Kathleen Butler on the screen there for us. Thanks for being here, Kathleen. Great to see you. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what you're up to, please?
Nyali Nachigun, Nyali Darama, Malichigun. We come from this country, we look after this country. Hi everyone, I'm Kath. I belong to the Bundjalung and Worimi people of coastal New South Wales, and I work at the University of Newcastle. So I have literally just stepped down from my role as the head of the Wallachita Institute, and I'm now the university's Director, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research Strategy and Leadership. So a role that in many ways is complementary to the work of Wallachita, but which sits in the Research and Innovation Division. So I'm a daughter, a mum, and wife, and I guess by training, masters in sociology and PhD, masters in anthropology and a PhD in sociology. So very much a social scientist at heart, but more recently, I guess, through my journey of indigenising curriculum and and the scope that that's given me to move across academic disciplines, I've become more and more interested in issues of environmental science and particularly where we are in the hunter, to the transition from fossil fuels to new forms of power generation, and also the remediation of those lands that have been damaged by coal-fired power.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much. And congratulations on your new role also, Kathleen. Yeah. And I just wanted to sort of talk about Indigenous knowledges that are increasingly valued by non-Indigenous people and institutions, for example, all of these people. Yet there are massive gaps in this knowledge caused by colonisation. What opportunities and what challenges are presented by this kind of current revitalisation trend? And that's a question for any and all of you who'd like to start off responding to that.
I can answer first if you like, John. The way I like to answer questions is by using examples. My example is during my time at the State Library, number one, it took me 5 months to get the courage up to take a book off the shelf and about 6 to order an item. And then the next experience I had when I finally ordered an item was I very politely asked the library staff member what to do with the book, how to return it, things like that. And very quickly I discovered through that lovely conversation with that delightful person that research into Victorian Aboriginal languages, and in particular Woiwurrung, was popular. I was just gutted and flabbergasted, surprised, all the swear words, because I could not understand how and why others would want to access material that I felt belonged to me. So I very quickly Yeah, I changed since 2022. I've really changed my approach to sharing any research, to sharing any revelations that I have about language. I keep, a lot of knowledge that I can reconstruct from language that can be applied in a cultural context, and I keep it for myself and I keep it for my family. I'll just give it another quick example, perhaps. I love seeing people use language. I love language around the city. I love things being named, but you know what? If it's not going to contribute to those words going into the hearts and the mouths and the minds of my people, then I don't support it. There's always this conflicting back and forth, juggling, this balancing thing that goes on within my body all of the time. Yeah, I just wanted to share that. I just found it, I found it, and as you can tell, I still can't really express it very well. Yeah.
I guess it's about what safeguards you can kind of start to put around this knowledge and how it's shared or disseminated to protect it and keep it for your communities, keep it safe, that knowledge. Yeah. John, did you have any responses to that kind of theme?
Just about language. Language is important whereas now I found after going into university and research is that the language will tell you what your culture is. If you don't have the language, you don't have the culture. You don't know about your culture properly. So and some of the words that we have, because we're an oral culture, some of most of our knowledge is in the language. If you don't know the language, you won't know what the culture is. I mean, it's important for the future that you speak those language because they have meaning. The words have meaning. And even I found that some outsiders did research and they wrote words that are sacred to us. But when I teach my students, I couldn't even speak those words in the books because they're only spoken in the right context and in secret language. And that's why I understand when you said you can't speak that.
Kathleen, do you want to tell us
Sure.
about your experience in this way?
Yeah, so I guess for me with language, I've been really privileged to be able to use those archives to return some of those voices to my family. So, for instance, I was able to get the recordings that the linguist Terry Crowley had made of my great-grandmother. And and I got those recordings in time for my uncle's 60th birthday. So, it certainly was a process to be able to access those, and I'm pleased to see that some of those archives, really are trying more proactively to return those materials to families and communities. I think, some of our other knowledges that are being revitalised that I'm very pleased to see is, things like cultural burning practices, because, many of us will be familiar with, some of the really dire impacts that we've had with not following, burning protocols, and how that's been really problematic for all Australians. And devastating, for some of our wildlife. So we've been really pleased to see the reintroduction of burning and the recognition that, this is a carbon positive way of reacting to the environment. I think that our understandings of things like the riparian zones in rivers and lakes and how, they operate to make sure that our river systems remain healthy. I think those kinds of reinvigoration are really positive. But I give the caveat there of making sure that that has the, the control of community and the protection of intellectual and cultural property.
Great. Well, that kind of brings us into like, I'll skip forward because I know we don't have much time, unfortunately. But obviously the future is Indigenous. So what are some of your visions for First Nations research and applications of these knowledges into the future? Anyone who would like to pick that up?
How long have you got?
Big question.
Yeah. I don't know, perhaps perhaps reflecting on what I've heard from other people today and from my own experience, that, the words that keep coming up in my mind are about balance, reciprocity, equality, and reckoning. Forget reconciliation. I think, for me, I feel there's still the great imbalance, and there's not very many, I'm just thinking about my own community, there's not many of us that have the skills and the knowledge, for example, to feel that they're comfortable to come into an institution and share their knowledge fairly, equally. And I suppose, I just appreciate, also I'm going off track, but I just wanted to say I appreciate everybody's honesty on stage so far. There's been a lot of beautiful sharing, so I wanted to say thank you, just while I remember to say that. Thank you for being open and honest. But yeah, there still is a big divide in my mind. And of course I'm talking about language in particular. I would like to see rules softened. I would like to see less linear rules and more access to information. I'll give you one quick example. I was attempting to access an archive in a particular institution. And of course, institutions have rules around access to protect material, which is wonderful. Basically, in short, I was told that I was not the right age nor gender to access this particular material. And just to share with the room that that's quite damaging and quite upsetting, because I am one of a very small group of people who are working hard to revitalise language. So I think there needs to be lots more conversations, and all of us sitting in this uncomfortable space of sometimes not knowing what to do next. And like the big tall managums and the big tall mountain ash that have been doing it lately in the wind, we all have to stand up straight and lean on each other when the big wind blows to forge, a path forward that's meaningful for all of us.
Because I'm in education and Indigenous culture, education is not from A to B, it's continuous. So I'll just read Nanga's vision. Is for all Australian students to have the opportunity to deeply connect with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge systems, histories, languages, and culture.
It's happening, but very slowly.
Yeah.
And just at baby steps.
Hmm.
Yeah. Kathleen, how are you? You started to talk about some of those, environmental kind of applications of Indigenous knowledges. Do you have other kind of applications you want to talk about of where you hope these will go in the future?
Sure. I think that one of the things that I found really useful, around not just archives, but around, our resources, our journal articles, our books, is the ability for us to be connected with other Indigenous peoples globally. So I've just come back from 10 days in Canada, and the similarities that we have, and the understanding of how people are doing it differently. So being in Canada and being able to discuss how they've turned the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into legislation, and how that's, moving not just from, that federal government level, but also at the level, more local levels, at the level of the province, which is giving, what we would term traditional owners, the space to speak in things like urban planning, in environmental regeneration. So I'm really inspired, by my colleagues in North America that I get to speak with, Maori and Pacifica colleagues from across the Pacific, and of course, here at home, I'm so inspired not just by academics that I meet, but by students that I see coming through, and community people that I see coming in to provide, feedback on ethics processes, and to start holding universities accountable for not just the questions they ask, but the way that they gather the data and what they do. And so I think that the more that we can, from all of those different areas, begin to place pressure on universities, then I think that, change is and will be slow, but, there's the potential there for us to actually do something really transformational. And, that's, I guess, the point where I like to work is at the level of that potential.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I think we do need to wrap it up pretty much. Are we at time or not quite? Another? Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know. Okay, great. I've got more questions. Aha. Sorry, I just looked at the time and thought, oh, quick. Maybe we can talk a little bit more into that kind of institutional space then, about what barriers still exist, or do you experience in undertaking research. Could you talk, what could make universities and libraries more supportive, culturally safe places for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, staff and researchers?
Oh, I've got a very quick, perhaps little thing. I was just reflecting earlier. So, for example, sometimes national policies don't work across Australia, because of the diversity of our peoples, the diversity of our history. So, for example, in 2018 and 19 in Victoria was the first chance for Victorian Aboriginal people to engage in a Cert 3 and Cert 4 level of learning their own endangered Aboriginal languages. So, kind of just to be aware of what's happening in that space, and that broadly, I can't speak for any other mobs, but broadly in Victoria, we don't really have people that are at a certain skill level yet. And so, of course, we still need to keep building up our skills, and then we will still be coming and challenging institutions for access to materials such as the vast amount of material that is available in connection with, say, just language. So I just think perhaps we all need to be mindful of all the different localised situations that can occur across the whole of Australia. Like, think about the differences between these three mobs here, all having their own successes and their own challenges.
Yeah, I just...
About your experience in...
Yeah, I just have a quick one, because I've been teaching Aboriginal studies for a long time, and what I do is that I allow person from community to speak to the class, and this is what I think is missing at the university. I mean, we have wonderful work with the library and all the resources that we have in the databases, but in teaching, in education, we need to bring people from the community to come in, because our elders are our elders will be gone, and we need them to come in to talk to the class. And this is what I've been doing during my teaching. I allow someone from the community to come in and talk to the class. So it's different from learning from the board and to have an Indigenous elder in the class talking to the group. I mean, like, You think I have one of my uncles from the Torres Strait came, and I allowed him to, when I was teaching at the University of Newcastle, Awalatuka Institute, I allowed him to talk to the students. And when he talked to the students, and one of the students from America asked him what he did, and he said, and he started to explain that he was in the Navy. So it's, you know, you got an elder who was in the Navy. So things like that, if you don't have them come in, you're never going to have questions like that to ask. You need community people to come in. And I guess this is what the university, you know, as well as a teacher, you need a person from the community, as well as the Indigenous teacher. You still need a person from the community to come in and to talk to the students.
That is ideal, but yeah, here in Naarm, often it's difficult. Yeah, Wurundjeri folk will tell you, like, that the people who are the advocates and the speakers for culture are so stretched. They can't be everywhere. So there is like, you know, it is difficult to always have that person there. But yeah, that would be ideal. Absolutely.
I think for me, you know, one of the things that's really important is for us to know what's in the library and what's in the archive. You know, quite often people are absolutely amazed to find out that their grandparents, great-grandparents, you know, are part of those systems. And so I think that there's a real need for us to, in a kind of structural way, you know, people have talked about Indigenous knowledges in libraries and in archives as being captured or hidden. You know, how do we actually bring that to the light? And we've seen right across Australia, I think, some really strong examples of how that has led to revitalisation of practice. It's sometimes, you know, there might be an elder who remembers hearing language, but when they are able to hear it spoken, you know, through these recordings, it suddenly, you know, comes back to them. Oh, yes, I remember that from when I was little. So we get this thing that's been captured, you know, sometimes on like a wax cylinder. So there's a voice that's been captured, but then there's someone who has a story who brings life to that archive. And so I think that there's such an important process that we can have of partnership, where we've got, you know, what was sometimes referred to as this dead knowledge or captured knowledge, and how we can bring that to life again. And in doing so, you know, remember our old people, remember, you know, what it is that they fought for, and to hear their voices again. So and to learn from their knowledge, I think is really critical.
Absolutely. Do you want to speak back to anything that each other said? Like, please no need to wait for me to.
Oh, I'd like to totally gush all over your beautiful captured. My brain's just gone. What you said, Kathleen, about the tea tree and that metaphor was just like, mwah, that was absolutely beautiful. And it's just so powerful to hear other Aboriginal people talk about, you know, their practices and their places, because it's always inspirational for me to kind of gain some energy and nourishment for myself to keep going. So I want to say thank you for being a part of this really cool crew.
Thank you so much. I've been really fortunate. I was able to write some journal articles with my mum, and now I've written some journal articles with my daughter, and I'm about to write one with my son. And I think one of the things that I love about that is that, you know, so many of our knowledges have always been linked to our genealogies, and it's such a privilege for me to be able to bring that genealogy to that textual form, you know, and it's that real, you know, what do they say, speaking back to the empire. Yeah.
Absolutely. And do you want to also share with us, Kathleen, any or, you know, some of the indigenisation initiatives that you have advocated for and are implementing within education and academia? I know you've had quite a history of that.
Yeah, so you know, and I think that one of the things that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics do just as a part of our practice is that it's not just about transforming the academy, it's also about transforming our communities. And we've heard some great examples from the other two speakers, but probably more recently, I was really very proud with Nathan Towney, the Provost Chancellor, Indigenous Strategy and Leadership, to co-lead a team, and we were given the opportunity to say, what would evaluation look like from a community perspective for the New South Wales Department of Education? So we were able to write a framework which is called Reimagining Evaluation. And so what we did there was we centred the students, the family and the sovereignty at the centre of evaluation. And we said that, you know, it's about stories, not just metrics. Because if you look from a school perspective, you might have a child that's attending 30% of the time and the school says, no, they have to be here 90% of the time. But if we can have a program that takes them up to 65% attendance, that might be to their family an amazing success, because the reasons why they might be away might be around culture or family responsibility, but it wasn't captured as a success for the department. So I think that, yeah, it really is about our ability to take what we've learned. And, you know, we did community consultation. You know, Nathan has led the implementation and the evaluation of the Connected Communities program. So we can see that, you know, we can start to really transform. You know, if we can transform what success looks like at school, then that's going to empower more kids, you know, whether or not they come to university. They might go somewhere else, but they're going to go with that system having recognised their strengths and their success, rather than, you know, these tired and outdated metrics. So I think indigenising curriculum is one part of indigenising, you know, so many systems. And, you know, we can now use that practice as an example for indigenising teacher education. So there should always be, I think, a real practice element and a community-based element to what you're then bringing to the classroom. We can absolutely support that with, you know, with text, with journal articles, with book chapters. That's another form of dissemination, but we also need to balance, you know, textual dissemination with practice.
Sure, that's great. We've only got 1 minute left. I was going to ask the floor for a question, but maybe we might just round it up. And did you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share? No. We were all good? Yeah, well, thank you so much. You're all such an inspiration, and yeah, keep doing the amazing work that you're doing, and we'll see you another time, I hope.
Thank you.
And they're all available online, and they go for about like 30 minutes, 40 minutes. So they're not one, you know, these videos, these interviews, they're not just little snippets. They're in-depth conversations. So encourage everybody to view them or put up your hand to be interviewed. And to cap off today, finally, well, not finally, it's just been such a big day, but I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Hemifanga, all the way from Aotearoa in New Zealand, who will deliver our final keynote presentation, Future-Proofing Our Knowledge, Developing Digital and Virtual Protocols. Dr. Hemifanga is Professor and Head of Massey's University School of Te Patu Te Putahioti School of Maori Knowledge in Aotearoa. Hemi has worked as a project leader and researcher on a range of projects centred on revitalisation and protection of Maori language and knowledge, including digitisation of Indigenous knowledge, artificial intelligence and virtual realities, ICT, digital repositories, ethics and digitisation curriculum, and Maori astronomy. He currently co-leads Abundant Intelligence, expanding artificial intelligence through Indigenous knowledge systems, Canadian-funded New Frontiers Research Fund Transformation Grant to mobilise an international and interdisciplinary team of experts coalesced in locally rooted pods to develop and build culturally grounded AI systems that support Indigenous sovereignty and ways of knowing. That sounds very impressive. Okay.
I ngā reo i ngā mana i ngā karanga mā tēnā koutou. Tēnei e tū whakaiti tēnei rangi. Ki te mea tiki o koutou, ki ngā whenua, ki ngā reo, ki ngā mano tēnei whenua nei. O te rā tēnei e tū aki nei, ki te mea tū ki tēnei ngā iwi take o tēnei motu, ki te iwi moi ai tēnei wā. Tēnei uri no Ngāti Kanu, Ngāi Tahu, Ngāti Mamo, me Waitā, e mihina ki ngā awa, e mihina ki ngā maunga, e mihina ki ngā whenua. No reira e te whare tēnā koutou. Isn't it great to be last? I can keep you here all night. I just want to acknowledge the land that we stand on and the Indigenous peoples of this land. It is a beautiful place. It is a beautiful space. I've changed my talk, had all these notes, I have 0. It's all up in here. So I did have about 80 slides, I've got it down to 50 and I might even talk to 5. That's how we do this. So my title, Future-Proofing Our Knowledge, and I'm speaking on behalf of my people from home, Aotearoa. I'm here to school of Te Pūtahia Toi. The name Te Pūtahia Toi speaks about obtaining knowledge from the upper echelons of where it is kept. A lot of my work over the last few years, 20 or so, maybe longer, I won't divulge my age, is centred around 4 things. The language, thinking about revitalisation of the language, particular languages, assisting those language activists, those in schools, and also those who protect and look after language inside tertiary institutes like this, and what sort of protocols do they set in place. Our cultural knowledge as well. One of the speakers before, I'd like to acknowledge the speakers today for sharing their thoughts, sharing for love of their language and culture as well. You can't have language without culture, you can't have culture without language. It's pretty simple. And in talking about that more generally, how do we store it? How do we protect it? And how do people access that? I suppose one of the really difficult things for us as scholars, and I'll talk about scholars in the broader sense, scholars in terms of them being practitioners on the land, and also thinking about what scholarship actually means. And those things around what it actually means to be someone who is actively engaged in building the intellectual capacity of your people. That is a scholar. It doesn't necessarily have to happen in tertiary institutes. So also one of the things I've been doing in the last few years is thinking about what does presence mean? Presence in the sense of you interacting in these digital spaces and these virtual spaces with your own knowledge and practice, with your own knowledge and cultural systems. So, you know, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey, have a bit of a yarn, a bit of a kōrero, and hopefully it can make sense before everyone falls asleep, before it gets dark. We have a saying, I hau mai tātou I te pō, ki te awa marama, we come from the darkness to the light. It's kind of a metaphor for us as Indigenous peoples that through our creation stories, we talk a lot about how we sat down and we discussed and we build opportunities for us to build ourselves as Indigenous peoples, in the sense of building from, we don't call it enlightenment, so building into what we can see, what we can feel, and what we can hear from the environment, and from those species living and non-living, because through our worldview and through our knowledges, we are connected to everything. We're connected to mountains, we're connected to landscapes and seascapes, and we're connected to each other, and we're also connected to the cosmos. So I'm going to take a bit of a chat today. I am going to show some pictures of some of my uncles and aunties who have passed, some of my ancestors today. But what I wanted to start off with was a little bit of discussion about this man on behind me. I consider him to be, I suppose, one. Is that me? It's a phone call from Pay. Pay Jones, the person on the picture here, I consider him to be one of our greatest scholars, academics that no one knows about. He was born, 1898. Sorry, I made you a lot younger than you were. And he did a lot of things for Māoridom. What I mean by a lot of things, so this is his genealogy here on the left up here. One of the things that he was an amazing scholar. So I'll just give you some of his background. He didn't actually finish high school in those days. He left early. He went out and became, I suppose, a scribe for his one of his uncles. A scribe in the sense that he went around and collected knowledge of that time. He was an amazing scholar. He wrote everything down. During his lifetime, he had a number of very important roles. And these important roles spanned from being the advisor to the Māori Queen and also to the Māori King. And also some of his really important roles was that he would buy food for the local marae, the community at home, during those really important occasions. So there is no kind of, I suppose in our circles, differentiation between those roles and obligations that you share within community, and also those roles and obligations that you share at the top of echelons of your roles in Māoridom. So he would go from being a translator at formal occasions when dignitaries came and visited the lady, all the way through to buying meat on the way home for a bereavement that they were actually undertaking at the same time. He, for example, translated Shakespeare because he felt like it into Māori. What I mean felt like it, he had that ability to take language and reshape it, and the knowledge associated with that creative, I suppose, spirit of the bard, and put it into our prose and into our words. He also took some of the most sacred knowledge in our houses of learnings, and he also created what I would call an amazing manuscript, amazing book, which talks about how language was taught in those institutes. And he wrote it like a play, like a Shakespearean play. It has actors, it has scene setting, it has gongs, it has what is the incantations that were said inside these houses of learning. And so he wrote that following, I suppose, the skill that he had to interpret those two worlds and to shift and shape what that knowledge would look like in his time. So I was part of a conversation to digitize his collection. These are his works. There's approximately 20 to 30,000 pages of manuscripts that he wrote in his lifetime. So these were manuscripts that he wrote and got someone else to type up, and also to put macrons on top of the length of the vowels and stuff like that. And these works were relating to Tainui histories. They were relating to ecological stuff, cosmologies, genealogies, all the way through to Shakespeare, all the way through to local histories, so on and so forth. So there's approximately 20 to 30,000 pages of material that was gifted to the University of Waikato some 30 or so, maybe 40 years ago. And some of you may know what microfiche is. I can tell you now that this generation doesn't know what it is. And having spent many of an hour scrolling through those, and now many hours scrolling through my phone, I think it's kind of a journey which all of us are very used to. So these were initially digitized and OCR'd into a collection, which were given to students at the University of Waikato and Hamilton, Aotearoa, for them to look through and also to, I suppose, to do research and to conduct, at that time was, groundbreaking kind of research in the area. So we digitized those. We made them available on that digital format, which was probably cutting edge of that day. So shift through to around about 2005, I was sitting at a dinner table in my former institute at University of Waikato, in what was called at that time the Faculty of Māori Indigenous Studies. I was having a cup of tea and one of my uncles came up and he was visiting and said, "We have a collection. Uncle wants to give the rest of Pay's collection to the university." And we were like, "What does that mean? And what scope does that mean?" And many of you who are involved in archives and collections, when someone comes up to you with an offer for you to take material that is currently housed in a garage, in boxes, you sit there with a little bit of trepidation thinking, given the mana, the prestige of this man, of the collection, you start thinking, what are the processes associated with that? What are the negotiations that need to happen? What is the ethics for a university to take a collection from the family, and who do we need to talk to? And as part of those initial conversations over the table, it was very obvious that Uncle Brian Jones, the son of Pay, had a number of roles within our university. He served on the council, and his father, Pay, was awarded the second honorary doctorate at the University of Waikato as well. During Pay's time, and this was where all the context starts to work when you start thinking about these things, during Pay's time he was gifted a number of cultural taonga artefacts. These included ear pendants, these included I suppose, weapons and clubs that were used for different occasions to mark different events right through his lifetime. And these taonga, these cultural artefacts, poor name, I'll just call them taonga, were also kept in his garage. So unbeknownst to us, we travelled down as a university, so we started that conversation with the university to start really articulating what it means to accept a gift. And gift in its broadest sense, so we're talking about a gift or koha, or tākoha to be specific, in a way that we would accept this treasure and look after it on behalf of the family. And we started that process off in a number of conversations with Uncle, his representatives, and the family. I'll take you through. We travelled down. The interesting thing is that we're all related back home, one way or the other, in the broad sense. And my colleague, my dear friend who has since passed, Rangi Headley, was a niece or grandniece of Pay. She worked with me. She was also a conservator. She was also an artist, but more importantly, she knew the context and also knew all the material that was being discussed. So I'll just quickly go through some of this. Here are some photos of Pay. That's the fine-looking man at the top. That's him and his wife, Hepana. He played rugby. He wasn't an All Black, but he did play for King Country and a number of the other small provinces. Also was a Māori tennis champion, which I did not know until I saw these photos. And what I mean by he was the advisor to our Māori king, and also the lady as well. And that's the middle picture in the middle there, some of those photos as well. So there is a number, there's a few hundred, maybe 1,000 photos, family photos that is in this collection. We also, when we visited to collect these taonga, the collection, you go through this process of, you go and share food, and we just thought we're going down there for a conversation. We took a van and a couple of boxes and stuff, you know, following correct archival procedures and conservation procedures. We took all the correct material, and we did. We turned up, we shared food with Uncle, and then we went down to his garage downstairs. One of the issues that Uncle was having is that if it flooded, all his dad's effect would get ruined. And we all know stories where over time that these things have been ruined because they had been sitting in cupboards and storage facilities that aren't quite up to standard. At the top here we have some genealogy scrolls. So what Uncle did was he pulled open a drawer and says, I have these. And my mate Rangi goes, I think I know what they are. I think I'll put that in this box that we have. And then he had things like, there's a huia feather on the top left up here of an extinct bird that we have, and he had these little annotated notes underneath that he handwrote. This is Pai saying, this is a huia feather gifted to me by Tupui Herangi, the date, and the one next to it is another one. You have also some of the other earrings. There's a fob watch in there that was also gifted. That's one of his. That's his OBE. That is the club that marked the boundaries between two tribal areas. And you also have some of the weapons, but also the whole process set off for us how to collect it and how to actually preserve it and conserve it and how to catalogue it. So you'll see these beautiful taonga here. They're actually placed in moinga, in beds. We call them moinga. When Rangiri was training us to actually place them in there, she'd speak to them, she'd sing to them, we'd have long conversations with them, interacting with them in the sense that they were still there and present with us. More importantly, it was teaching us, those, you know, myself and a few others that were associated with, including the librarians at the university, how to respect the context and the knowledge associated with these taonga, and create them beds, just like we have beds, so they're comfortable, so they can relax and they can interact with each other. This is Ngā Mōtetea. This is a collection of songs that was collected by Tā Apira Nanata in the early 1900s. And Tā Apira Nanata was a dear friend of Pai, and when he passed, he translated about 20 or so of these Mōtetea, and then Pai spent the next few decade or so translating the other 200 or so that is in that collection. These are his handwritten notes that we have here, and also his copy. Right, here's a challenge for everyone in the room. The one on the left is called Huriahiha. Can you tell me the English name of Huriahiha? Shakespeare. Julius Caesar. I'll give you that one. Ōwhero. Oh, that's pretty easy. And what about Te Tangata Whai Rawa o Weneti? The Merchant of Venice. So these are his handwritten translations. This was the one that was typed up, and also the version that he self-published, I think it was in the 1960s. So we have copies of those in the collection as well. So we went down and collected the collection. We wrote a deed of gift and the deed of gift is written in Māori. And that was, the deed of gift was, I suppose, a piece of work that took us a lot to actually formulate things around access. How do people access the collection? How do we digitise it? How do we ensure it? How do we protect it? Who can get access to this material? So on and so forth. And when the room, this room here, Mahi Mare Kura, was opened, I can't remember what year that was opened, the ceremony between the opening of the room itself and also the signing of the deed was between the Vice-Chancellor and the Māori Queen as the representative of the family. Given their status and relationship to this collection. This room itself, we had to develop a lot of, I suppose, cultural understandings, is a nice way of putting it, and protocols in the way that you applied an ethical and procedural practice in archiving, cataloguing, and the physical layout of that room. And how do you conserve it? Conserve it in the sense like which order, and we had a set of drawers, which order did you place those taonga, those artifacts together? How did you lay them out within your tables? Do you put them in a linear sense, or do you order them according to the context and historical factors in which they interacted with at that time? And that's what we did. The archiving was very much an ongoing discussion between ourselves as Māori, I suppose, scholars, as Māori librarians, and as a librarian as well in terms of their own practices. Underpinning all this, we really thought long and hard about using Māori subject headings as a way to structure the way that the whole collection is presented. What do we mean by Māori subject headings is it is organised by Atua Māori. It is organised by our Māori gods. So those are the top levels in terms of how it's organised. So they control a domain in which they look after. When you start cataloguing stuff, you start thinking about oceans, Tangaroa Ocean. And then you start thinking about his children and those domains in which his children control and have power over, and the knowledge that drops out of that. So when we started thinking about archiving, we started thinking about our worldview, the way that we see things, and controlling the way that people, and controlling in the best sense, the way that they interact with it themselves. It's no use putting up a website where everything looks a particular way, and it looks particularly Western, and it looks particularly Pākehā, when the knowledge inside of it is our knowledge, our way of seeing the world, and our way of understanding the world. So we started looking at, and during those cataloguing processes, you know, a colleague of here from Taranaki, tēnā koe te tuine, started talking about having more than less description. So when some of our people have multiple names, and my father's a great example of somebody who's got 4 or 5 different names, you need to include all of those names in terms of the names. And also the spellings, the correct ones, and sometimes the incorrect ones, because those are the ones that get picked up within those systems. And then trying to think about the location, the place in which this knowledge and those tribal associations in which this knowledge was associated with. So all that went into the thinking, not of the room itself, but also the collection itself. And then from there, acknowledging Pei and the amazing work that he undertook during his lifetime, but also the knowledge that went in that was gifted to him on behalf of his people to carry on behalf of all Māoridom, I suppose. And then we looked at the way that the physical layout happened. So the room itself, is actually based on a wharepuni, which is an ancestral house. you enter it in a particular way, you interact with the knowledge inside in a particular way. Those taonga are placed in a particular spot as they would be in their house. One of the things that we didn't do is that we didn't separate the wood, the weapons, the manuscripts from each other, like you would if you took it to a library or archive. You go and place it somewhere else. You go and place, if you went to an archive in Wellington, for example, you would have the wood in the wood sections. You had the bone in the bone section. You have the manuscript sitting somewhere else. So what you automatically do then is you separate it from its core understanding, from how it would actually interact with each other when Pei was interacting with it, when he's writing these manuscripts, when he was talking to his ancestors and his uncles and his aunties and those knowledge holders, and recreating that knowledge and sharing it in written form. So, because I'm really good at drawing pictures, I just draw circles. So at the core of this is having Pei as the subject of all this. He's the subject, he's the kaupapa of it all. And around there you have cataloguing, layout, archiving and conservation. But those are normal practices that you do with any, I suppose, anything that comes into the system that you're all involved in. But around that, we start thinking about the genealogy of that knowledge. Where does that knowledge come from? The genealogy of that people who are involved. The genealogy of that landscape in which it's connected to. Attached to that is the usage. In that context, we're talking about how was it used, that knowledge used during the time in which it was used. For example, a particular weapon. But also, was that weapon used in a war with another tribal area? A really good example that my mate Rangied actually spoke about was when she worked at a museum, and she'd go down every morning with one of her colleagues. I believe it was the Waikato Museum. And there were a couple of taiaha, the long-handled kind of a weapon. And she'd go there in the every morning, and then they'd place them that night, and they'd be nice and straight. They go out in the morning, and they'd be like this. And they go, oh, okay, who's been in here? And they straighten them out again. And they go back the next day and to welcome him, to acknowledge them again, and they'll be like that. And they started going, oh, I think something's happening here. And so they went and had a look at the provenance of these two weapons. And they found out that they were actually used in battle with each other. And they were still continuing the jostling, and the conversation had started 100 or so years before. So they separated them, did a ceremony, and did a karakia, an incantation to ensure that that happened smoothly, separated them, and then they were happy. No more of the jostling, so they went and put them with ones from where they're from. And so they sat where they should have been sitting in the first place. So when my colleague laid out these taonga, she thought about how to conserve it and look after it for future generations. What the historical context in which they were, I'm talking about the manuscripts, the knowledge, the time in which they were used and why they were used. Sometimes there were a couple of ear pendants that were used by people who fought each other. Head being the most sacred part of your body. She separated them and put some love hearts in the middle because they were actually part of the collection, to separate them, bring a little bit of peace between them, because they actually fought each other. So these types of considerations when looking at collections, when looking at knowledge, were fundamental in the way that this collection came together. And surrounding that, we talk about ethics, we talk about tikanga protocols. For us, it's the same thing. You need to do right by the collection itself. You need to work with the right people. We had advisory groups, multiple advisory groups, when we put the collection together and when we actually started publishing and republishing the material on behalf of the family. and including the family and all those learned elders in those conversations about, are you comfortable with sharing this with the multitudes? Like Pei wanted to do in 1960s, and some publicists said, we don't have enough money to do it. He'd written down all that correspondence and kept it together. So we undertook this task on his behalf, not because of academics, but on behalf of the family, on behalf of the knowledge community, and behalf of the community, to ensure that this knowledge was passed on for future generations. And whilst we're doing that, we also digitised it. I haven't even talked about my AI stuff, I don't think I will. So we developed and thought about, and this is, I sat here today and I was going to talk about AI, and AI is going to be a big player in the knowledge economy. Can't deny it. Everyone in this room is already affected, but also, I suppose, knowledge generation for us Indigenous peoples very much talks about control and who has control and who has power. In terms of AI, we don't at this stage. I had a look at the map, and today there's a map that popped up and it showed kind of a world map of where people were getting information from and accessing a database. They're probably scraping those databases. So that's what the Singapore map would show. Silicon Valley, there's a big bubble over there. They're scraping your material. That's what a lot of that is, to get access to knowledge. So one of the things when we think about establishing protocols in the digital space is the integrity of the information itself, the integrity of the people who collected it, and the integrity of the peoples in which it belongs to. And you think about from there the integrity, if it's a physical collection, the collection itself, and you also think about the integrity of the individual or the family involved. So it's all about integrity, ensuring that they have an active role to play, and you have an active role as well to ensure that the integrity of those collections are maintained. And also, contextualising it. There's no use giving out information if there's no context to it. If I didn't tell you that, for example, we changed the name of a book to Tuhi Mareikora from Tapu, and the reason why we did that is because sacred, in terms of a title for something that you're going to send to the masses, is a little bit problematic for most Indigenous peoples. And the hundreds of hours that we sat down and thinking about, why did he name it Tapu? Can we use another name that'll make it a little bit more, less, I suppose, cause less anxiety for our people when engaging with this? And the number of elders, knowledge holders, experts that we consulted, we come to a conclusion that Pei was going to do it. We'll do it on his behalf, but we're going to change the title. And we're going to use the Māori word for the title. He had also a Māori title, and we only used the Māori title. So there's things about contextualising the information which we use, but also contextualising the information which we were drawing from. You've got to develop content. You've got to develop control mechanisms. You've got to develop multi-layered access points for different individuals. Family need to get more access to your collections than, for example, normal Māori or researchers or government agencies, because they have full control and access. Some of them do, some of them don't, depends on the context and who they are. So all those access points need to be considered when building your digital, I suppose, repositories. And I suppose, and it has been my goal, and this was 20 years ago that we started on this journey, and it's still going, is for projects similar to this in which families, sub-tribes and tribes control their own knowledge and information. And this is the transformational component of this. These conversations have been happening for a long time in Aotearoa. And even in our context, in which I felt like this morning we're a long way ahead. We're regressing again as a result of a change in government, as a result in a change of the way that they respect our knowledge and the way they are trying to, I suppose for us, talk about things around equality, but you have to address the injustices of the past before you can actually get to a starting line in which is all equal. So we're having a tough time at home, but we have put a lot of work into ensuring that we're future-proofing our ability to control our future. We're future-proofing it in terms of maintaining our language, maintaining our cultural integrity in places like this. I got up and spoke at and I have to say, I love librarians, I love information technology. They're the greatest people in the world. They got me through my PhD. If I didn't, so all this stuff that I've been working on for the last 20 years started off with a conversation at a table, which led me across to the building next door to talk with the librarians, whether they had a space for this collection, because we didn't have it in our physical, in our space, which led to 20 plus years of working with a family and working with one of many collections that I'm proud to be part of. But more importantly, I think for everyone in this room is that you're willing to engage in a change process that you know it's going to be difficult for some of you to understand. Why do we push back as Indigenous peoples at certain particular points? The big thing is that you need to listen and you need to observe and you need to take advice. And sometimes that advice will cut straight to the guts, straight into your heart. And you say, as a professional, I've been taught to do this a particular way. We give that advice because we have been through this process multiple times. It may be the first time for you and your organisation, but listen and learn and don't make the same mistake multiple times, because we will cut you out of all conversations if you keep making the same mistakes. We have the right as Indigenous peoples to say no. Whether that be in terms of you accessing our knowledge, or whether that be you coming into our territories to tell us how to suck eggs. We have absolute right, and we will say it. You can't do that anymore. So things are changing. I don't think they're changing fast enough. I think a lot of times we get caught up in our own processes. We get caught up in our own covering our own backs. Take the leap of faith. Do it for the right reason. But make sure you're not speaking on behalf of Indigenous peoples. Make sure you're not the mouthpiece for us. We can speak for ourselves. I heard a lady before in the last talk. She was online, so I've forgotten her name. My apologies. I think it might have been Kathleen, who talked about Terry Crowley. I worked with Terry Crowley. He was one of my lecturers in linguistics. He spent many a year trip in Australia capturing the voices of these communities. I don't think he actually did. And he passed away really unexpectedly, quite young. He had tapes and tapes and tapes in his office, which at that time, I'm not sure whether those communities had a copy of those. I don't know. All I want to say is, do not leave those things in your office for someone else to clean up, like Terry. Make sure that there are copies with those people who you've interviewed, and also ensure that you've done the ethically correct thing and making sure that they are comfortable with you putting them into your tertiary institutes. I work on a kind of a mechanism now that the knowledge is owned by my people, first and foremost. Any derived knowledge, IP, is up for discussion. first and foremost, owned by us, belongs to us. We control it. We have the power over it. It's ours. And any institute or government who says it's not, then we're not coming to play. We will not put that information into those institutes. Nor will we play with those institutes. Play in the sense I'm saying, researchers who come to us and haven't done their due diligence, don't know about country, don't know about protocol, don't know about language, you can stay at home and twiddle your thumbs in your office. Do your core business, learn about country, learn about language, learn about history. And then when you come to see us and speak with us, we know that there is a conversation that we can have face to face. Don't cold call us, don't send emails, go through the right channels and be the right person. Make sure that you have integrity in your own work. And I know you all do, because you spoke about it today. I'd like to thank everyone who's still awake at 5:07. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more about my digital stuff, it's all online. I'm sure you don't. But the stuff that, and I suppose the processes and procedures that I learnt as part of this collection with our library, and also want to have a shout out to some of those, but in particular, one of my colleagues, David Bainbridge, who works with an open source digital library software that we use as, I suppose, the core infrastructure and building PACE digital library. The work that he's done and also his colleagues at University of Waikato have been fundamental in continuing this work that I've continued to do for the last 20 or so years, moving from virtual realities through to artificial intelligence, ensuring that we have protocols in which we can enter into these conversations safely and ensuring that our knowledge can enter them safely as well. Nō reira, e te whare tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou aramai tēnei ai nei, tēnei e tū whakaiti i tēnei wā. Kia ora. No questions.
Oh, thanks, Hammy. That was wonderful. I mean, what a way to finish the day. Took us on quite a bit of a journey from those intimate spaces to where we, to those final statements. I think we are actually running pretty late for questions. Is that right? We're not taking questions? Okay. So thank you again, and just pass you off to Jamie. Thank you. Get off. Go back.
Oh, that doesn't matter. Well, we're just going to wrap up today. I think there's been so much that's happened, and there's been an audience online that has been working on this Mentimeter that they've shared some reflections as well. This is the vibe from online. Be proactive in updating metadata, start projects looking at cultural sensitivities and making it a library core initiative. There are many projects underway in updating metadata, reclassifying DUI on items, incorporating yarning into BAU, be critical, reflect, learn, collaborate, and act. Ensure that guidelines and toolkits are implemented locally, including the referencing toolkits. Advocate for our colleagues to attend the IATS's core cultural learning module. Ensure that there is better inclusion of First Nation knowledges and make it a library priority. Also discussed is the need to move past apprehension, move on from the fear and get stuff done, convince and advocate on the value and importance of doing this work and ensure that there are appropriate resources dedicated. And finally, continue the conversations, progress your connections and embed protocols into regular workflows, join the communities of practice, come to the next symposium, be prepared to shed light on, be prepared to shed old practices in librarianship and upgrade your cultural competency and awareness to describe, apply, and amplify Indigenous knowledges. So that was the comments that came from online today throughout the day. I think you could connect that to some of the things that we heard from the morning to now. Probably they would have more to say after what we heard this afternoon too, but we just don't have time. This morning we were asked to think about language, start standing up and bringing evidence of past wrongdoings to light. We need to rewire our brains, as Tui says, to view Australia through an Indigenous lens, and finally that listen, observe and take advice as we're going through this process. So I hope you leave today with a new set of lenses, or clearer lenses. And we'd just like to thank the Informit First Peoples Steering Lens Committee, RMIT Storey Hall, Social Science Weeks for including the symposium in their program, all of the presenters and panelists, the convening team, especially Dr. Gretel Taylor, who did so much for the running of the day and the what we have to say today. So thank you for that, Gretel. And Sarah Germain, Laki Sedaris, Ali Skill, Sarah Davidson, Dr. Sarah Polkinghorn, Leon Rydam, and Emma Juniper, who we've missed on this committee. But yeah, I think that's basically what who we need to think. Do you just have one thing to add?
Important thing to say. After this, we're going down to Captain Melville's Max Hotel, the oldest pub in Melbourne, apparently, for some dinner and drinks. So, and on that,
with that note,
I think we're good. I think let's go. Thank you, everybody.